I'm going to start recording. Sorry, you were talking about Christian Wolff's influence. Yes?
Yes, and he seems to have an incredible influence on Kant, particularly. I noticed it, uh, but I'm thinking, why have none of us ever heard of him?
Well, so I mean, he was an academic philosopher primarily, and he was certainly influential in part because of uh, being treated as the predecessor and foil of Kant. That's where a lot of people first encounter him, is in the pages of Kant. But the other thing to understand about him is that he wasn't really such an original philosopher, but he
No.
was following in the footsteps of Leibniz, really. Um, so there was plenty of German philosophy in his day that was based upon Leibniz, and he was kind of systematizing Leibniz, making him more logical, and putting him in the kind of logical form that Spinoza was sometimes found in. And he was, showing the ways in which, Leibniz was, in continuity with the scholastics before him, and all this kind of stuff. So he was trying to do this academic systematizing thing. He wasn't really trying to be original. He thought that the basic concepts of philosophy and metaphysics had been figured out by the scholastics or the early moderns in the Descartes to Leibniz tradition, and that it was only necessary to sort of explain that and make it systematic and logical for the graduate students, understanding, so to speak, make it more mathematical, make it a mathematical discipline, and so that was influential at the time, but pretty much only in Germany, because outside of Germany, that was just thought of as Leibniz, right? It was just, Leibniz's echoes elsewhere was what was people thought of as that philosophy. They didn't think of it as Christian Wolff's philosophy, because he wasn't like the originator of it. And if they were thinking of the flavors of modernism, they thought of, Spinoza and Descartes and Leibniz and maybe Locke on the British empiricist side of things, maybe Hobbes. But the German, semi-idealist dogmatic philosophy that was thought of as modern wasn't really associated with Christian Wolff. It was associated with Leibniz. But Wolff is like 50 years after him and not that different in the content, but just a lot more systematic in the exposition, so to speak. Did you have a comment, Gabriel, on that? Okay. Welcome. So I have started recording. Gonna ask about first impressions. Just want to briefly overview. There's 2 more chapters in the book, but only 1 more session for us because the very last chapter is like 25 pages. So I'm figuring that we're going to do both those together because in a way they're both Gilson's own take on things, and they're really kind of a piece. So I'm thinking that we'll do 1 more session for all the. And what is Gilson's take on all this? We've heard about how he reads the whole history of philosophy up into his own time, but now he's going to tell us why he thinks Aquinas, solves all these problems for him. And so that's going to be the final session. It will include all of chapter 5 plus the short chapter 6. Not going to go reading the appendix part where he's basically answering some objections from other people in his own school, so to speak. You can read that if you want, but I don't think it's as interesting as the part where he's, explaining things himself. But anyway, that's just foreshadowing where we're going. This chapter is pretty much, all of modern philosophy from Descartes to Kierkegaard. That's not all modern philosophy, but it's modern philosophy up until the early 19th century, up until the period in which there's this kind of Aquinas revival that Gilson himself was kind of a part of, even though it's 100 years later. And we can see sort of all the motivations for his version of Aquinas, and Aquinas that's after Hegel, Kierkegaard, and reacting to Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard. The pivotal figure in this chapter is definitely Kant, right? All the stuff before them is setting up for Kant, including especially the Christian Wolff stuff. The stuff on Hegel matters as a reaction to that, Kierkegaard likewise, but we're really seeing a lot of Gilson's own motivations in the Kant discussion, I would say. So it is important that we know the stuff before that, especially all the Christian Wolff stuff, and then to a lesser degree the Descartes and Spinoza stuff before it. It's noteworthy that in Gilson's sort of periodization, the big hinge, the big change point comes with Kant. It doesn't come with the change from the scholastics to the moderns. It doesn't happen between Suarez and Descartes. It's not, Cartesian ego cogito that is, remaking the modern world in terms of modern metaphysics. On the contrary, he thinks that all of that is still, of a tissue with the Middle Ages, so to speak, or with scholasticism. But the big break comes with really Hume and Kant. Hume as a reaction to that scholasticism, and Kant as a reaction to Hume. So we'll have to talk about Hume as well and all that. Okay, I do want to make sure we get to the Hegel stuff and the Kierkegaard stuff at the end, because I think they're interesting figures in their own right, as well as his take on them being interesting here. There's definitely parts of Hegel that he manages to explain, and others that he doesn't necessarily manage to explain, because he's, again, it's this issue of not sympathetic with that school of thought, can't really tell you everything that that school of thought thinks. That's also very noteworthy in the Christian Wolff section, which we'll get to. And it's also worth asking, just as you're reading the parts of him being critical of Wolff, or the parts where he's half agreeing with Kant, what sort of expectations Gilson is kind of setting for you already before he's given you, in the later chapters, his own exposition of what he thinks the right answer to some of these things is, because it's not obvious yet, right? There's plenty of places where it sounds like his objection to this way Wolff puts it, or this way Kant puts it, is that he, of course, everyone knows, and there's an X sitting there that he's expecting to already understand, and sometimes he'll explain it to you, sometimes he won't. And sometimes that position doesn't look at all like Aquinas's position, or like his own position from other chapters, or it's not obvious, right? So the point is to track whether or not there is one position that is being the opposite of all these different people being disagreed with, or it's a shifting position. It's also worth tracking, is, as usual with Gilson, I have to track, is he being fair to the people he's disagreeing with, right? Sometimes he's using them as his witless foils, so to speak, and he wants to, contrast some position with what he's calling Wolffian essentialism or something. But it's not clear that the Wolffian essentialism fits as neatly into his ideal type bag of essentialism as he, Gilson, pretends. So we'll get to some of those. But anyway, those are just my overviews of some of the things that are the obvious topics we wanted to cover in this chapter. I'll also say that in terms of understanding his motivation, this is in a way the pivotal chapter, because especially the discussions of Hume, Kant, and in a way Gilson's sense of the justice of Hume's and Kant's problematic but dissatisfaction with Kant's resolution of it, so to speak, is kind of the proximate motivation for his own position, right? So and in that sense, even if we're not getting his full explanation of his own position here, we are getting its motive to a huge degree. Okay, so just highlighting the importance of the chapter that way. So with that said, first reactions to reading Existence versus Being. Whoever wants to go first.
Well, it's a very, I thought it was a packed chapter. It covered what, five gentlemen, and even sort of brushed on Spinoza to sort of tantalize one a bit.
Yeah.
But I did find it nice to go through and see the chronology, because see, I know nothing of Hegel except that he's some kind of mystical whatnot that was sort of the spawn of bad guys. And I heard about Kierkegaard mostly understood when we discussed him in regard to the Nietzsche book. You had a digression at one point pointing out how Kierkegaard dealt with one of the claims that Nietzsche was making. But Kant, I didn't know anything about except his existence and his importance. And I'm pleased to see how I've now seen a linkage, between starting at Descartes and Leibniz. Once again, I'd heard about, but I'd only heard about him in response to Voltaire's novel Candide. and
Okay.
the idea of the best of all possible worlds, which struck me as being, huh? But did he invent calculus? And yes, he did, and all that. So I just didn't know anything about him.
Right.
I'm so much of a Brit,
Right.
Newton.
Right. If it's Locke and Hume, you know it well, and you know all the traditions around it. And if it's over on the continent, it's that stuff over there. I've heard about it.
Right. But it fascinates me because my interest in von Mises and the Austrian Economics School, which is all totally subjective as they claim,
Mhm,
I'm sort of interested in reading where are they coming from,
mhm.
and I'm beginning to see it. Thank you.
Okay. Um, Alex, just first reactions to the chapter.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Yeah, kind of enjoyed this chapter. I have some background in Kant. Um, it was very interesting to get a discussion of that problem of existence in relation to Kant, because in Kant, really, it is such a nebulous issue. And there's so much, almost like a kind of mysticism around, this X, this object equals X. And so it was good to get some of the context, because one thing I find around modern philosophers is they're often really treated out of their context. Like very few people actually link modern philosophy with what came before.
Mhm.
Sometimes maybe with ancient, but the medieval philosophy is just kind of it's as if it never happened. So that was very helpful. And I guess my question around Kant, and I wish that Gilson had talked more about this, is the issues in the second critique and Kant's moral philosophy.
Mhm.
Because I have this feeling, and it really is just a kind of intuition, that um, actually some of that, Kant's discussion around the moral law and around this, he sometimes uses the word infinity when
Mhm.
it comes to that. I have a
And the
sense that
third
it's actually
critique.
connected with existence. And Gilson, I think, gives a paragraph or two on that, but very kind of doesn't really focus on that. So that's one of my, I guess, question marks.
Yeah, it's fair to say that for Kant himself, the second and third critiques, the second is, for those who don't know, a practical reason. The third is judgment, right, which includes all the aesthetics, which is also where he treats of the sublime and the infinite, right, are covered more in subjective than, sorry, in the critique of judgment rather, and aesthetics than in the practical critique, which is about morals. But in both of those, there's a place where Kant is sort of leaving this realm for reason and freedom that is distinct from the kind of Newtonian Enlightenment philosopher that you kind of get in the first critique, where it's all about epistemology and what reason can and cannot know, what we can and cannot reason about. And if, in a way, Kant's system is trying to say that something like physics is possible, but natural theology isn't. But he also wants to say that he doesn't want the idea that natural theology, rational natural theology, isn't possible, means that that rational morality isn't possible. He doesn't want it to mean that. So there is a realm of freedom in Kant that he is trying to save for part of the content of reason, so to speak. And in a way that does, as you say, foreshadow some of the things in Kierkegaard's focus on existence, etc. There's the same emphasis on the practical and the beautiful and the infinite and all these things as something which is beyond what just speculative reason and scientific understanding and scientific rationalism or something like that, critical rationalism, deal with. And so there is, in a way, that whole other side to Kant. And it's fair to say that academic philosophers who study Kant, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, mostly study the first critique. They mostly study the epistemology stuff and the pure reason stuff. Now, it's fair to say, though, that modern universities force everybody to study Kant on morals too. He's like the categorical imperative and the grounding the metaphysics of morals, all that stuff is it's the standard thing that people get from Kant in sophomore and junior philosophy class, or social sciences or humanities at their university, whereas often they're not expected to understand something like the first critique unless they're a philosophy major. The common core Soc people at the University of Chicago will all read the grounding of the metaphysics of morals, right? And the morals stuff is felt to be more approachable and more more general interest, something like that. So Kant's moral side isn't completely shortchanged, but it's fair to say that for its academic influence among the professors as opposed to the students is probably more from the first critique than from the second and the third. How much that relates to existence, though, is a different question. I think that Gilson has this tendency to want to equate anything having to do with existence to have to do with how to put it. He's so convinced that the essential is the mental, is the rational, that he wants to think of any aspect of life that isn't fully described by those. They all become the same thing to him as an other to that category. It's like he's got an ideal type of what counts as essentialism, and it's something like Cartesian mentalist rationalism. And if that isn't explaining everything about the world, then everything else has to be covered by this existence term instead. And it's not clear that the actual problem of being or existence essence question can bear the weight of that much problematic, so to speak. Not everything is about existence, if I can put it that way. But he sometimes wants everything which isn't a mentalist version of essentialist rationalism to be covered by the term. We also have to ask how, where is this association of essentialism with mentalism coming from in Gilson? Because that's not really there before Kant, right? It's Kant's actual Copernican revolution itself that makes people from Kant, Hegel, that tradition, think of the essential as the mental, something like that. Before then, when Christian Wolff was thinking about it, yes, he might think this is about concepts, but he's not just thinking about it as concepts as things in the mind. He's thinking about it as concepts as the things which the concepts are trying to refer to, as the external realities of things. And the external essential realities of things he thinks are reasonably directly accessible to thought, so to speak. And so he's not thinking about those things as being just thought-like. He's thinking of them as being objective and truth-like, and there is no connotation that because something is essential, therefore it is merely thought-like or merely mental with some merely in front of it, right? The notion that the essential is an interior thought-like subjective or something really only comes after Kant. And Gilson is buying into a bunch of that without necessarily agreeing with the reasons why Kant is going there, so to speak. It is noteworthy, for example, that Aquinas would not. Aquinas does not think that essences are mental, right? He's got a whole separate, doctrine of, how we refer to things and, of how thought functions. He's got this whole, reading of Aristotle's De Anima, which he'll explain to you, all these things about the intellect, right? But none of them issue in the claim that essences are just thoughts, right? In Aquinas himself. So in that way, Gilson is more of a modern than the Aquinas he's pointing to is. Okay.
Is that a way of saying, just a clarification on that, is that a way of saying that Aquinas, as you describe him, is a certain kind of conceptual realist, or perhaps a realist about universals, whereas Kant is more properly described as maybe a conceptualist, that they are just mental.
So
in contrast to the nominalism of, let's say, of a Hume.
Well, certainly neither Kant nor Aquinas are nominalist, right? But Kant's own understanding of this is something like a he's trying to be a critical idealist, and critical idealism means that he doesn't think that idealism is true, but he does think that idealism describes how we have to think about the world, something like that. There's an idealistic aspect to how we have to think about the world, even though the world is not a world in which idealism is true. That's sort of where Kant is coming out. So it is a limitation of human reason that we think idealistically, right? Something like that. Whereas Aquinas is not. I mean, there are other places where Aquinas is aware of, limits of human reason, so to speak, but much less so than Kant. It's not his theme compared to Kant. When Aquinas is thinking about limitations of human reasons, he's thinking about questions that cannot be decided by reason alone and have to be decided by the extra information from revelation or something. But Kant is much more suspicious of the capacities of reason, if I can put it that way. And he's getting that in part from the skeptical attack of Hume on the possibility of rational knowledge, right? Which he takes, way more seriously than an Aquinas would. And we'll, get to how justly that is. But in all of that, I think that Aquinas is kind of a realist and Gilson is kind of a realist, and it's one of the reasons he likes Aquinas, more so both of them than Kant is, at least in an unproblematic sense of realism. Kant would tend to regard most of things which others would regard as realism as being part of dogmatic philosophy for the most part. What do I mean by that? The dogmatic philosophers think that they can trust human reason to uncritically give them access to and information about the true, real nature of the world, and so they expect that the thoughts they understand to put them out in the real world, right? And Kant thinks that thought is way slipperier than that, and it is you're receiving in part the receiving apparatus rather than the stuff on the outside of the receiving apparatus. That's the famous Copernican turn. One of the things that Gilson is claiming here is that one of the reasons that Gilson thinks that Kant does that is that Kant agrees enough with Humean skepticism. Humean skepticism is basically saying you cannot see real connections in the order of empirical events, right? You can have any degree of connections you see in logical constructs and in towers of thought and in systems of mathematics, but when you're trying to do physics, when you're trying to be empirical, when you're trying to observe the world, you're not going to see necessary connections between things. And Kant agrees with that enough to say, you're right, we don't see necessary connections in things empirically. We put them there, right? They are projections of the mind trying to understand and synthesize the nature of the world in order to help guide us. Because we put them there, we do not know how trustworthy those constructs are, according to Kant, right? So that's the way in which it is Hume's empirical critique of rationalism, so to speak, that is motivating this limitation in Kant. He's agreeing with Hume that we don't see necessary connection in external insensibles, so to speak. And if we don't see it there, but we nevertheless think that way, that means that we're putting it there. And to Hume, that's just a habit. To Kant, it's not just a habit. It's a necessary way that the understanding tries to organize the world. But the fact that the understanding has to organize the world that way does not ensure that that's the way the world actually is, right? Whereas to previous rationalist philosophers, it kind of did, right? They thought, yes, that's how we have to think about the world, but we think about the world that way because it's functional to think about the world that way, and it's functional to think about the world that way because that's the way the world actually is, right? We wouldn't have the natural tendency to think about things that way if it was completely misleading. We wouldn't think that way if it wasn't a true guide to things. Our faculties would be pointless if they did not manage to give us true access to the truth about the nature of things, right? So there was a confidence in the natural equipment of the mind, so to speak, among the early moderns and the scholastics and the ancients to a degree that is not there in Kant, in part because of Hume's skepticism and Hume's critique. Go ahead, Alex. Alex, your question.
Yeah, so just to follow up then, wondering about this problem of universals. You know, the standard formulation is there are those three positions: nominalism, a kind of robust realism, and then a kind of middle position of conceptualism. Should we say that Kant really is giving a fourth option, where this critical idealism is a new way of thinking of universals that really wasn't an option with those three, that medieval discussion?
I mean, in the terms of that medieval discussion, he's a conceptualist in the sense that he does think the universals are concepts. It's just that he also there's a question about what is the status of concepts. He's changing the status of concepts at the same time that he's saying universals are concepts, right? So it's not the same status that concepts had to the medievals, but he is claiming they're concepts.
So instead of coming from the world into our minds as a kind of, I guess, broadly Aristotelian notion, it's the other way around. Like it's mind to world or mind to experience.
Right.
That's the direction of that's where concepts come from.
Right. And there's a degree to, you can get into different versions of how much, how accurately that happens, how motivated that is, how practical versus theoretical it is. There's all kinds of different takes on that aspect of it. But the original Platonic kind of rationalists thought that you could reason about the world and get thought and the world to line up because they thought that the world was made out of thought-like things, either because it's idealist or because we can just think in the same categories that the world operates in, right? So the Platonic idealists thought that there isn't a lot of slippage between the machinery of the world and our thoughts about the world, right? And we'll see that again in Hegel in a way for a different reason. It was an idealist of a different sort. But and all the medieval realists who thought that you can think of universals as real external objective things, right, are following that kind of Platonic tradition. They think that thought can guide you to the world because the world is itself made in a thought-like manner, if I can put it that way. And sometimes that's directly equated to theistic understandings of it being literally made by thought, right? And other times not. But still, it is a thought-like made thing, so of course minds can understand it, right? That's sort of the Platonic position. And compared to that, Aristotle is more skeptical than that, right? Because he's much less committed to that kind of rationalism, and he's a critic of Plato's versions of those ideas. He wants to know where those ideas actually are, right? And so on, right? So that there's already a notion of a critique of Platonic, the realism of the ideas, very early, in Aristotle himself, right? But you get more or less strident versions of that through the history, more or less skeptical versions of that too. A lot of the early nominalists were skeptical, were just skeptics, right? Yeah, okay, so that maybe that helps on the understanding the relationship of the universals question to the, if I can put it this way, the status or trustworthiness of reason question. The other thing to understand here, though, is that the Hume that Kant is reacting to is an extremely skeptical position in all that. Gilson presents him as straight empiricism. He says that Hume is just straight empiricism. Locke is straight empiricism. Hume is something more than just straight empiricism. He's empiricism plus skepticism, right? When Gilson wants to give you an example of a just given reality that you just have to reckon with as an absolute brute fact of the world, he mentions something like the existence of Julius Caesar, right? That's an existent to Gilson. Hume is a person who's not sure whether or not sugar sweetens his tea in the morning, right? You try to tell him that you know that Julius Caesar exists, he's going to laugh in your face, right? You've got a few old scraps of coins and a few old manuscripts smeared on with ink in foreign languages and a dubious chain of custody from about 20 human beings who are probably lying, right? And you think that this means that Julius Caesar is a given existent, all of which happened 1700 years ago in a different country, right? That is the very farthest thing from evident to David Hume that Julius Caesar exists. That's not his obvious. That's not what he would think was an obvious proposition. Right? But when Gilson thinks of an obvious proposition about what existence is or what givenness means, he thinks that Julius Caesar exists as an obvious given, right? This just shows that he might be a realist, he might have an empiricist streak, but he's not a Humean skeptic at all, right? Hume would never reach for that as an example of something which is obvious, right? It's not obvious that, as I say, that you can that one billiard ball makes the other move when you crash them into each other, right? So the idea that you would follow that whole chain of reasoning out to the existence of this man Julius Caesar and his dying in the Senate House according to a certain a story about it, right? That's not what there might be some evidence for it, but it's not a given reality. It's not an example of an existence that just hits you over the head, right? We'll come to what counts as given for different people later, but I just want to point out that Gilson himself is very far from being nearly as skeptical as someone like a Hume is. Okay, let's back up a little bit. We jumped right into Kant, but I want to back up to some of the other people. But first reactions. Gabriel.
So yeah, I found it a fascinating chapter. Like someone said before, a lot of thinkers packed into it. Some that I'm a bit more familiar with, so it was a bit easier to follow. And it kind of helped me also to understand Kant's position a bit more. There's a quote from page 131 where he says, existence then is an X which Kant never eliminates because he never completely betrays Hume, and that X remains an X because Kant never completely betrays Wolff. So I found that quite kind of illuminating, or that whole approach. Where I got stuck was more with Hegel, who I'm not fully like I've read a lot about him, but I don't fully understand his system. And so
yes.
I think Gilson assuming maybe some basic knowledge of Hegel or something, because I really wasn't following that part of it. So I'd be interested to hear how that unfolds.
I can definitely help with the Hegel. Gilson himself, when he's explaining Hegel, is going to let Hegel sound like he's contradicting himself because Gilson doesn't like Hegel, and having Hegel contradict himself is a good way of showing what he doesn't like about him. But Hegel is more sensible than he comes off looking in that chapter. Now, to be fair to Gilson, he does lay out some of the core bits of Hegel's argument correctly, and he especially lays out his take on Kant correctly. But there are aspects of what Hegel is doing that have a force and an evidence to them that Gilson completely misses. And I can easily explain all that when we get there. The fundamental thing going on there is that Hegel is a true idealist, and Gilson almost cannot conceive of what that means. so when an example, when Hegel is talking about the concrete immediate, right, and talks about concrete universals and the concrete immediate, Gilson goes looking for examples of what makes it concrete in terms of the total web of relations in which something is enmeshed or something like that. That's not where Hegel is coming in at all, right? When Hegel says the concrete immediate, he's basically saying to the Humean empiricist, you want empiricism? I'll give you empiricism. You have never experienced anything in your life that wasn't the interior of consciousness. Everything empirical is consciousness. You not only have only ever experienced absolute spirit, you are absolute spirit. And you have never touched a material thing in your life, right? So the concrete immediate is the interior of experience as subjectively experienced in consciousness. That's what he means by the concrete immediate. He means the entire tissue of not only sense experience, but every internal mood, every impression, every intention, every chain of thought or reasoning you've ever engaged in. All of that is the concrete immediate, stream of consciousness, if you like, of spirit happening in the world. And spirit happening is the data for everything else. You may call it superficial, you may call it a mere appearance, you may look for other structures underneath it, but it's the data, right? And you don't get more empirical than that. And the typical Humean or Lockean empiricist thinks that when he's talking about the empirical, he's talking about sense experience, and he means things like rocks outside of his head, right? And Hegel is like, every rock you've ever seen was inside your head, right? Seen and inside your head are synonymous, right? So when he says the concrete immediate, he means the content of consciousness, and that's what makes it concrete. What makes it concrete is that it's the data, it's the original, it's the ground, the ground state of appearance of phenomena appearing to us. Okay. And that's also what makes it immediate. We haven't processed it yet. We haven't organized it yet. We haven't decided this one is a perception and this one is a thought and this one is an intention, right? After we've made all those divisions on it, we've put all kinds of categories over it. We've organized the crap out of it, and only then do we take this section over here and call them perceptions of external things. There's a giant theory and a whole conceptual machinery necessary to siphon off some things from the interior of experience and call them perceptions of exterior things. And Hegel's whole point in that is the farthest thing from being free of concepts. That is the farthest thing from being free of essentialism, right? It's founded on essentialism. If you don't start making essential distinctions about your interior experience, all you get is the blur of interior experience as spirit, right? So the point is that Hegel is coming in on the ground floor with an idealistic howitzer, right? That is just taking all of your, the stuff that Hume is skeptical about, and he says you're not a tenth skeptical enough, right? All you have is thought, right? And everything else is how you're organizing the contents of thoughts to try to make some bloody sense of it, right? But all the data is thought. So that's the starting point of Hegel's take on Hume and the degree of empiricism that he wants to keep, right? So for Hegel, empiricism and something like mentalism do not contradict one another, right? You need some giant theory to get out of mentalism. You start there. You were born there. You're made out of it, right? So that's where Hegel is starting from, and it's why he's going to end up with something like an absolute spirit and a conceptual world as the world we actually live in. But that's the kind of thing that Gilson is realist enough that this never occurs to him. It never occurs to him to think that the world is so thought-like that everything he's thinking of as external existence are first just experiences. They're first just subjective experiences. and anything else you want to assume about them is going to have to get pretty essentialist and pretty mental and pretty thought-like to put some structure on them that is different from immediate experience. Immediate experience is always subjective, right? If you want to get something which is less subjective than immediate experience, you're going to have to use mental machinery to get there. You're going to have to use some elaborate theory to get there. And you're not going to do that by appealing against essentialism to some sense of the concrete immediate. The concrete immediate is mind all the way down. So that's the sort of the point about Hegel's reaction to Kant that that Gilson kind of doesn't get, or kind of just doesn't agree with. Now, that is also related to what Hegel's take is on the indeterminate X that that you mentioned, Gabriel, that Kant never gets rid of because he never betrays Hume, right? Hegel betrays Hume from the first step, right? Happily on that point, right? He's going to say that indeterminate X is literally just your concept for what my mind might not know, but because you defined it in such a way that your mind will never know it, right? That's its only meaning. Its only meaning, its only content for you is a mind shadow, which is a mind thing, right? Not an outside your mind thing, right? It's a mind shadow of your own mind, and you know, that's all the Kantian thing in itself is going to mean to Hegel. And Hegel is going to say, the part of that that's right is that there is a kind of contentless indeterminacy of the content of your thought, right, that you are aware of. There's a kind of formal indeterminacy about it because it can contain anything. There's a kind of infinity about it, right? And that kind of infinity about it is actually the infinity of absolute spirit, right? The completely unconstrained nature of thought itself and the unknowability of the Kantian thing in itself are mirror images of one another. Both of them are simply the complete universality of spirit, Hegel. And so that formal equivalence is what he uses to just poof away the Kantian thing in itself. The actual Kantian thing in itself is mind, right? So that's how Hegel, you know, navigates out of the Kantian critical idealism into a just flat out idealism, right? So he's no longer critical. He's saying, yes, the world projects the mind because the projected mind, sorry, the world projected by the mind is the world. The mind doing that projecting just isn't only your mind. That's the only, it has to be the universal mind. It has to be universal spirit. So that's where he's not a Berkeleian solipsist, right? But that's Hegel's starting point. Did that help with the any of the Hegel business?
Yes, it helped a lot. Yes,
Great.
thank you.
We'll definitely get to the the individual things that come out of that, but that's the fundamental thing about Hegel that yeah, Gilson, that is so idealist that Gilson can barely believe that someone thinks that, right? But Hegel does. Okay, Craig, you want to give us first reactions to the whole chapter?
Yeah, I have to admit I struggled getting through his version of Kant, I guess is the best way to put it. I felt like he was building straw men in some cases and wasn't too certain what to do with them. So I was half inclined to blow this off and listen to it later and watch the ball game, but I decided to get on here anyway. Mainly because of Kierkegaard. I think he actually did a better job at Kierkegaard than I even remember my teacher doing when I went through Kierkegaard. I thought it was very well done. I wondered maybe he just didn't have the same bone to pick with him or something. But yeah, he kind of resuscitated the chapter to me with his going through Kierkegaard and made it much more understandable, much more relatable to the fact that I was really studying as much theology as philosophy when I was in college. So that was a nice crossover. Hadn't realized how much Tillich had actually gained from Kierkegaard in a very interesting way. So that was good. But and Hegel, I think he again may have been a little bit of straw man creation there too, but did a reasonably good job on it. And I echo what the others were saying about Christian Wolff. Surprised I never heard of him before,
Yep.
and so that was very intriguing. But generally, I decided I want to come here. The teasing out of Gilson's version of Kant versus what we know what the better representation of Kant is, and what his agenda is in the way in which you presented Kant. So that's the curious part that I had with this, and I think we've already started touching on that.
Started, yes. I think you're right that he is more sympathetic to Kierkegaard. He in the end doesn't want to come out in the same place as Kierkegaard, but he is extremely sympathetic, especially to Kierkegaard's reaction to Hegel. Right? He thinks Gilson has the same kind of reaction to like essentialism as such, right? Or these mentalist essentialist rationalisms of the Kantian to Hegelian variety, right? He has the same kind of reaction to all of those that Kierkegaard has to Hegel specifically, right? Which is that it seems like a tower of abstractions, it seems like a mental game. It seems very far from human life and the things that matter, right? And Gilson is extremely sympathetic with that reaction to Hegel. If I can put it that way. But we'll get to some of the things about Kierkegaard specifically. I think that there are parts of Gilson's take on Kant which might not be perfectly fair. He's much less fair to Wolff than he is to Kant. He's more sympathetic to Kant here than he is to Wolff, honestly. And of the people in the chapter, I'd say he has the most sympathy with Kierkegaard, and that's probably the second most with Kant, and even a little bit with Hume. And less with probably the least with Hegel and then second least with Wolff. But maybe he doesn't like Descartes all that much either. But yeah, Gilson is he's probably distorting Kant. He certainly has a particular take on Kant. He used his importance in a particular way. The thing to most understand as the way in which Kant looms huge in Gilson's world is that to him, Kant is the person who shoots down ontological arguments for the existence of God. Right? He's the person that says ontological reasoning is illegitimate and you cannot derive, any that from a what. Right? And if that's so, it means that most of the arguments for the most of the proofs for the existence of God that the medievals had don't fly anymore, right? And Gilson is deeply concerned with the question: does that argument of Kant go through, or is it something which only shoots down a particularly weak position that he had set up in front of him? And his diagnosis is that Christian Wolff had taken post-scholastic philosophy to a particularly weak place where Kant could, in shooting down Christian Wolff's metaphysics, could shoot down the possibility of ontological arguments in general. And that's the thing that he is trying to avoid. The particular thing he's trying to avoid is that all ontological arguments fail. And he wants to get back to a place where there are scholastics who can make ontological arguments without them failing. So he wants to find a version of scholasticism that is not subject to Kant's critique of the ontological argument, if I can put it that way. So if there's one, critical piece on the board that Gilson doesn't want to get captured, it's: are you ever allowed to make ontological arguments about God? And he, in order to address that, he's not just going to, he's not taking on Kant in the sense of trying to shoot down Kant's particular argument for it. He's basically agreeing that if essences and being are what Wolff says they are, then he can see how Kant's argument does go through. But that's just proof that Wolff was wrong about essence, right? So that's the fundamental setup he's got here. He thinks that Kant was able to shoot down ontological arguments because he was shooting at a particularly weak opponent, right? And he wants to create the stronger opponent who can get into the lists with Kant and not lose that argument. And he thinks that he's going to find that in a re-understood Aquinas, something like that. But he also is trying to explain the history, right? Why is it that ontological arguments have disappeared? They disappeared because of the prestige of Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason, right? And so why did that happen? That happened because Kant was able to make a strong argument that ontological arguments were impossible because he only had to shoot down Christian Wolff. He didn't have to shoot down Thomas Aquinas, right? So that's in a way Gilson's diagnosis of how you get to a 19th century in which the option seems to be an impossibility of natural theology, or a natural theology slash idealism, which is Hegelian and idealist and not realist anymore, and vaguely a rationalist, or a reaction against all that from Kierkegaard, which says a pox on philosophy, as this is where it comes out, so to speak. None of those 19th century options are attractive to him because they all say you have to come out in a position which isn't a realism, isn't a rationalism, isn't a philosophy, or doesn't allow the possibility of rational proofs of the existence of God, right? And he doesn't like that, set of choices. He wants something which gets out of those choices and back to what the scholastics had, which was, rational arguments by realists for the existence of God, right? So that's just to understand sort of the brass tacks motives or motivations here. And that means he has an ambivalent attitude towards Kant. Kant is a person who is the propounder of the argument that, takes out the thing he cares about, but he is not going to try to attack him on the ground that the argument he specifically advanced against the opponent he specifically advanced against was unjust. He's not going to try to defend Christian Wolff. He's instead going to say, judo fashion, yeah, you can take down Christian Wolff, big whoop. So can my aunt Mabel, right? Can you take on Aquinas, right? So that's the sort of the structure of the rhetoric here. It's that Kant's argument against Wolff, yes, that's just, but it's because Wolff was so weak. Now, that requires the idea that Wolff was so weak to be true. It's not obvious, right? He's got to prove that now, right? He's set himself up to have to be just to Christian Wolff and still make Christian Wolff susceptible to this argument for removable as opposed to essential reasons, right? It's not clear they aren't essential reasons if it's susceptible to it at all. That's why it's important to pay attention to, does he treat Wolff fairly? Because if he makes Wolff out to be less reasonable than he is, then he's kind of making his job easier for himself, right? Okay, so that's just, so it's useful that you had those reactions, useful to, worry about, you're right to worry about where he's being distorting or where he's not and what his motives are, but maybe that helps a little bit understanding the motives here. For him, the status of ontological arguments is at stake in this whole impasse with Kant. Okay. Right. And from Gilson's point of view, all the philosophies that are putting essence first and are treating existence or being as afterthoughts compared to it are going to be susceptible in this way, because all of them are going to have a realm of essence, which is something like a purely logical realm or a purely mental realm, and they're all going to be susceptible to the same critique of what assurance does anyone have that that purely logical realm of essences has anything to do with reality, right? That's the critique he sees Hume making and Kant taking seriously. And he thinks that that means any metaphysics that starts from essence, right, whose core idea is essence, is going to be susceptible to this attack. Now that may or may not be true, but that's his concern. That's his belief, is that it's essentialism which is open to this Kantian attack, is what he's saying. Okay, so part of his animus against essentialism, besides his general realism itself, is he thinks it's weak to the Kantian attack. Okay. That was good on first things. I want to go back to the stuff before Christian Wolff for a second. He deals with Descartes and Spinoza kind of just in passing. He barely mentions Leibniz. He mentions him a little tiny bit at the beginning. And all the stuff down to Wolff, right, goes by in just a handful of pages. And the fundamental thing there before we get to Wolff is something like, on this question of being in essence, they're all Suarez, or they're all agreeing with Suarez. I think that I think that that's mostly fair. There are parts of what they're doing, which is, in some ways closer to Scotus, or including things from Scotus as well as Suarez. And there's parts of Descartes that are going all the way back to Augustine, for example. But Augustine and Suarez are the people who influenced Descartes, and Spinoza is also influenced by Scotus and Maimonides, and Leibniz is definitely also influenced by Scotus, maybe even more than Suarez. But that set of people are all sort of a camp to Gilson. I just want to point out it's not just Suarez for all these guys. What he also makes clear, though, is that for all of these, if I can put it this way, the 17th century modernizing rationalist philosophers, and this is the point he emphasizes, they're all, as he puts it, holding high the God idea of the Middle Ages, right, the same way, right? That whose essence involves in existence, the God essence of the Middle Ages is everywhere carried shouldered high, and every philosopher of note pays him unrestricted homage, right? This is on page 112. So the point is, before you get to the Hume-Kant period, all the modern philosophers are in basic agreement with the scholastics and back to Avicenna. They see nothing problematical in in what he's calling the God essence of the Middle Ages. What's curious to me is that here on page 112, he also tries to contrast that God essence notion with a God as being notion that he thinks of as being distinctly different from it. And that's a much harder claim to make, right? He's got a very thin claim here, thin in terms of the amount of words he's ascribed to it, right? Where he's trying to say that the God essence and the God existence are diametrically opposed things, when to Avicenna they're the same thing, right? Avicenna is not trying to disagree with the idea of that God is that whose essence is that it exists, right? That's Avicenna's own concept of God, right? All of these people have basically that same concept. All of them are using the being concept as the core concept of their idea of God, right? It's just Gilson is sometimes noticing they're using the being concept, right? That makes them essentialists. And if he just turns around and says they're using the being concept, then suddenly it would be something different. It's not clear it's different at all, right? All of them have the same first concept at the top of their hierarchy. These are not Platonian Neoplatonists who are putting the one above being and thought, you know, and they have having being as the second or third person of the Trinity or something. These are not, you know, even more ramified than that. These are all guys who, just like Avicenna, just like the cross-civilizational consensus of the High Middle Ages, they have the same God idea that is the same essence of being idea, right? And all of them think that that is a rational idea of God that they can find in versions of in Plato, they can find versions of in Aristotle, they can find versions of it in all the monotheisms, and they think it's in the same, it's basically the same idea. And down to Spinoza, right? They're all agreeing on the content of that idea. They're not violently disagreeing about it, and the claim that they have forgotten a right idea of God that was left back in 1270 or something, Gilson has not proved this at all, right? Okay. But then he says, the times are now ripe for some systematic scientific being qua being, as completely free from existence as being itself actually is. And then Suarez begot Wolff, but his birth had been announced by science. So this is the whole intro to Wolff, right? Wolff is meant to be the core essentialist philosopher for whom essence is first. And we first have to just understand the structure of Wolff's system, right? In Wolff's system, ontology is the top, not the top concept, but the top science. And under ontology, which treats of being qua being in its absolute generality, you have three other special sciences that deal with specific spheres of being qua being, right? Those are theology, cosmology, and psychology, or pneumatology, he calls it, but a spirit as opposed to psyche, as opposed to soul, right? But the souls or mind, the physical cosmos, and God are all three places where the concept of being winds up being thought about in a more restricted manner, right? In Wolff's system, whereas ontology is the science that tries to think about it before that distinction is made, right? So, and that ordering of it by the sciences that investigate it and their generality, instead of by the importance of the concept within it or something like that, definitely irks Gilson. And he also thinks that it means that essence has been put above existence, because for him, the top of the existence hierarchy is often the theology part of that structure, right? So from Gilson's point of view, you have a God that is existence or is being at the top of the hierarchy, right? And you're only going to get to anything like cosmos or souls as different aspects of created being under it. But theology is the top of the hierarchy, and there isn't an ontology sitting over all three, all of the others, right? There isn't an ontology that's above theology for Gilson. There is an ontology which is higher than, in the sense simply of more abstract and more general than natural theology for Wolff. Next thing to notice about this, though, is that Wolff is not someone who doesn't think there's rational theology at all, right? He's not doing this because he is such an essentialist that he thinks that rational theology is impossible. He thinks rational theology is perfectly possible, and it deals with this one particular concept over here, the concept of necessary being. The concept of necessary being is what gives rise to natural theology. So it's happening inside conceptualism, dealing with a particular concept. That particular concept is necessary being. And the concept of necessary being issues in the entire area of natural theology for Wolff, right? So what the point here is that Wolff is not someone who is putting essence at the top because he wants to get rid of natural theology. He's not putting it at the top in order to make a natural theology impossible or unimportant. he's putting something above it because he thinks natural theology treats of one particular concept and ontology treats of a more general concept, right? Being qua being, which all these things would have in common. Okay, so that's just to understand Wolff's own system, right? As he talks about in 119, and he's fairly accurate about laying this out. Are we interested in 119? If we are interested in finding out the sufficient reason for the existence of God or for that of the world, natural theology will give you the answer. Do we want to know how those beings which make up the material world are, though contingent yet determined? Cosmology will inform us about it. Are we wondering how in the human mind the possibles of drawing potency act? Psychology holds the key to that problem, right? So all three of those are particular sciences to Wolff, right? Within philosophy, but under the generality of ontology, which only treats of notions of being or essence or logical conceptual machinery, so to speak, in ways that are true across all of those. From the standpoint of later philosophy, that ontology is really just meant to be something like a metaphysical logic. It's just how you think about entity as such, right? It's meant to, explain to you, the logical machinery of thought about abstract things, something like that. And then the things that you're going to think about as abstract things that way are minds, the cosmos, and God, right? That's Wolff's system. But just as any Aristotelian might methodologically put logic before all the particular sciences they're dealing with, and expect you to have fully understood, the prior analytics and the posterior analytics before you go try to read the metaphysics, Christian Wolff expects you to have studied ontology before you study natural theology, right? Okay. Is that clear in terms of what Wolff's own system and structure of his system is? Because I realize this Wolff stuff is, people don't study it directly. So you're only hearing about it from somebody who is, two different people who are taking it apart in different ways. And you might not know what Wolff himself was trying to say. No questions about it.
I was just amused by, he says, spoiling a few textbooks is a minor accident in the long history of the Wolffian tradition.
Yes, and what he means.
119.
Yes, and the spoiling of textbooks that he's thinking of is that we're going to have the wrong chapters in our philosophy textbook, right? Instead of having theology as the first chapter, right? We're not going to get to theology until chapter 3. We're first going to have a chapter on logic, then we're going to have a chapter on ontology, and then we're going to have a chapter on theology, right? And so we're going to have this extra ontology chapter there that doesn't really belong, right? According to Gilson, right? So that's what he means by spoiling the textbooks. They're going to have chapters in them that shouldn't be there. But what he Gilson says is that this is modern scholasticism having lost the sense of its own message. His point being that if you're Aquinas and you're writing the Summa Theologica, right, you're going to put theology first, right? You're not going to put it third.
Put in your title.
Yes, well, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, you don't put it in the title, but it's still there. Okay, okay, and then the other thing that's noteworthy on that page, he says, strictly speaking, an ontology is a metaphysics without natural theology because a metaphysics without existence. And this is not fair, right? Why is this not fair? Because natural theology, according to Christian Wolff himself, treats of the concept necessary being, right? Wolff still has a place for what Gilson is calling existence. It's just over there in the theology department, in the theology section, right? Where we start with the concept. Is there a being which is a necessary being as opposed to a contingent being? If there is, what does it entail? And we unpack that concept ontologically, right? You make ontological arguments about that concept, right? That is natural theology to Wolff, right? So he does have a notion of existence, and he even has a notion of necessary existence. And his notion of necessary existence is even his notion of God, and that's even the basis of his rational proofs of the existence of God. They're just off there in the theology section. And the fact that they're not at the top of the fact that they're in chapter 3 instead of chapter 1 leads Gilson to claim that it is a metaphysics without existence, which is, just there is no lack of existence in Wolf. It's just not in chapter 1. It's in chapter 3, right? If we can put it that way. Okay. We next have to go through the what a text, right? There is this is it runs from where is it? Yes, from bottom of 116 to the top of 118. He talks about his scrupulously exacting methods of determining being, that the results were not really new. The results are the same traditional ones we have, right? And the thing which Gilson particularly notices is in the course of discussing this, he says, he quotes Suarez and Thomas on the issue of essence and presents them as agreeing with one another. And Gilson says that according to Wolff, Suarezism has consumed Thomism, right? So Suarez swallows Thomism. This is what bothers about the passage, right? Is that there's no difference between Thomas and Suarez left in Wolff's position of the two of them. And to him, that means that the essential things in Aquinas have been forgotten, right? That's his take on it. But the other thing you have to realize is in this section, right? He's saying all that because he's saying that he has forgotten Thomas Aquinas's real distinction between essence and existence. And that's the thing which he's imagining is forgotten. Because remember, the particular topic on which Aquinas and Suarez are disagreeing here is there a real distinction between essence and existence or not? Suarez is on the side of no, and Aquinas is on the side of yes, right? That's the famous thing that this is it from the Suarez's metaphysical disputations. This is the section that's about it, where he's, Suarez is laying out his own case itself, right? They disagree on that topic, no question. Is that the thing which Wolff is in the middle of explicating here when Gilson says that he doesn't see the distinction between them? No. They're not talking about whether or not there is what about the notion of existence, the definition of existence. Wolff is trying to give you a definition of essence, right? This is the section of Wolff where he is giving you the definition of essence. It starts with the notion of essence, right? And then he goes through and gives you a full-blown definition of it. And he's claiming that definition of it is one which Suarez and Aquinas and Aristotle would all substantially agree upon, right? This is not a definition. This is not a definition of existence. It's not ruling on the question of is there a real distinction between essence and existence. It's just defining essence. Okay. Does Gilson explain why this definition of essence is wrong? Does he show that this definition of essence is not one that Aquinas agrees with? He does not. He just says, here is the definition of essence. And in this definition of essence, he says that Suarez and Aquinas agree, and that means that the distinction between essence and existence has been forgotten. Okay. And this is to Gilson proof that scholasticism forgot the Aquinian legacy, so to speak. Now, in the next chapter, he'll try to tell us what that Aquinian legacy that should have been remembered was, right? He hasn't told us here. It's just hidden. Just something essential is forgotten here, and he doesn't tell you what it is. He'll tell you later, right? but the passage where he's laying this criticism at Wolff is one that is simply trying to define essence. Okay, if you go to that actual definition of essence, I don't think Aquinas would disagree with it. I don't think it's a definition of essence that is controversial. I think it's a definition of essence Aristotle would probably agree with. There are a few innovations in it that are from Wolff himself, particularly the notion of one of the factors in it being prime. That's a notion of his own. But what is he actually telling you? Wolff is trying to tell you what you mean by the essence of a being. He's not talking about essence in general. He's not talking about being in general. He's saying, supposing you have a being, what do you mean by the essence of that being? Right? And he claims that essence is a kind of operator on that particular being, which picks out and denotes certain special things about it and only those things about it. Right? And he'll tell you what those things are. They're such attributes. First of all, it's a set of attributes. That's the first thing it tells you. What is an essence? An essence is a set of attributes. You get it from the math. You can get that in a math textbook, right? So it is a set of attributes, and it's that particular set of attributes which has the characteristic that none of them are removable from the thing without changing the thing from not being that thing. Sorry, from being that thing to not being that thing, right? That's what it means. The first part of them being essential. So you cannot remove one of these attributes and still have the same thing. Of accidents, you can, right? Blue statues are still statues if you paint them orange, right? The color that they're painted is accidental to there being a statue. It is not one of the essential attributes, right? And that's exactly the same definition of the essentiality of an attribute that you would get in Aristotle. It's not controversial. The extra piece that he's adding is that they must also be what he calls prime. And what he means by that is that they are not such attributes of the thing as are fully explainable by other more essential attributes of the thing. So what's an example, right? He gives the example of an equilateral triangle, right? It's a plane figure with whose number of sides is 3, and where the length of the sides is equal to each other. He claims that is a set of attributes of the equilateral triangle that is prime. Why are they prime? You don't have to include something like they have 60-degree angles between them, because you can deduce that from the others, right? You don't have to, have something about, the length of the altitude, right? Or where the 3 altitudes cross, right? All those extra attributes of equilateral triangles they might be, in some sense, irremovable properties of equilateral triangles, right? But they're not prime attributes of equilateral triangles. They don't need to get into its definition because they can be deduced from its definition, right? They are in a sense secondary consequences of the essential attributes definition. Okay. So first thing to notice, this is meant to be a definition of essence. It's meant to be a definition of essence that would work for a mathematical concept. He's not necessarily talking about, Julius Caesar or, rocks. He could easily be talking about, equilateral triangles, and those are some of the examples he gives you, right? So we're talking about beings in that abstract sense. And he's just trying to tell you, 1, that essences are sets of attributes, and 2, that they're sets of attributes of very particular kinds, non-removable ones that are prime, that you can't just deduce from the other non-removable ones. Okay, this is all meant to be a definition of essence. It's not meant to be a definition of existence. It's not meant to be the distinction between essence and existence. He's not trying to settle a controversy about the formal or real or mental distinction nature of the distinction between essence and existence. He's just trying to tell you what the hell an essence is. And this is what Gilson picks as the what a text to show that Aquinas has been forgotten. It's very curious, right? The thing which comes across most upon it is that it is unjust, right? It's not a fair characterization of what is going on here to say that a definition of essence is a forgetting of existence. If you want to criticize a definition of essence, you can show the things that ought to be in the definition that aren't in it, certainly. You could show the ways in which this definition of essence doesn't work with the definition of essence, or it isn't what Aquinas thought of as essence, or it isn't what Aristotle thought of as essence. Those would be perfectly reasonable ways to critique this. But to say this definition of essence doesn't make a real distinction between essence and existence is a very curious thing to say. It's like saying this definition of an equilateral triangle doesn't solve the prime number theorem. Why would it? It's not what it's about. It's a definition of essence. Anyway, I don't know if that was striking to anyone or not. Okay. 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 So it is fair to characterize Wolff as handling these essential concepts with a childlike simplicity, in the sense that he expects that his conceptual machinery of what essences are and so forth is going to give him immediate access to the bones of the world, right? This is something he shares with Plato, with with Leibniz, with Descartes, right? Hume and Kant may disagree with it, but it's how to put it? If it's an ailment, it's a common ailment. It's not a particular ailment. It's all of philosophy except for a few ancient skeptics, right? Okay. The next thing we have to get to is Hume's critique, right? So the claim is, before we get to Kant's solution, the claim is that Hume had a critique of Wolff-like essentialism, which is so powerful that it knocks it over, right? So he makes remarks at one point that this is a large charge of existential explosive. He says, if as soon as a little bit of existence gets into an essential into philosophy, essentialism immediately goes to pieces, right? He thinks that the Humean attack on essentialism is immensely strong. So the first question to ask yourself is it? There isn't a lot of treatment of Hume here, right? The Hume that matters is the stuff on page 122, right? Sorry, yes. As Kant himself was right after reading Hume, it is absolutely impossible to see why, because a certain thing exists, something else should also necessarily exist. Nor does one see how the concept of such a connection could be deduced a priori. Nothing can be more true, for if you allow existence to get a foothold in philosophy, essentialism immediately goes to pieces. What Kant himself had discovered in Hume's analysis of causality was the irreducibility of actually given causal relations to the analytical properties of abstract essences. Okay. So how powerful is this Humean objection? Thoughts, reactions? When you read this, were you like, well, obviously Hume was right? Anyone who hadn't noticed that was, just clearly wrong.
I've often wondered that. Well, because it seems to me that I had not heard any refutation of Hume that satisfied me, and I didn't know enough about Kant to even think that he might have done it. But it's very interesting that I'm thinking, this is a very enlightening chapter.
So I mean, there are people much later, like Popper, who think they have actual formal refutations of Hume. on an epistemological basis, even from a fairly skeptical side. There's also traditional arguments back to the looking around for a particular thing from Averroes. Yes, okay. This book, Averroes and the Metaphysics of Causation. Basically, in his arguments against the skeptical occasionalists, Averroes argued that basically the Humean skeptical position was substantially equivalent to the position of Ghazali and his occasionalist skeptics, who basically were saying the philosophers claim to know things about either metaphysics or physics that they don't actually know and that aren't actually certain, and they should abandon their pretense of rational knowledge in these things because they don't know what they're talking about, and actually everything is completely uncertain and completely unknown and completely up to the will of an omnipotent God. That was substantially where the Asherite occasionalists were. Ghazali was sort of half with them and half at least citing their arguments. But Averroes' argument against this was there are no natures unless there is causation, basically. The very idea of things having essences, of things being distinct at all, is based upon the practical reality of causal reasoning. There's no such thing as a will of God because there's no such thing as a will at all without causation, right? And the thing which goes to pieces if you let in complete occasionalist skepticism is anything like rationality, according to Averroes. So it's not like philosophers hadn't previously considered skeptical arguments against the possibility of causal knowledge advanced in substantially the same form, right? Hume's form is not new. His arguments aren't any more sophisticated on the point than Ghazali's are. They're so in many ways less. Some of the same sort of basic skepticism goes back to the Greek skeptics and Sextus Empiricus and such. But the particular arguments about ability to know causal facts, were High Middle Ages regular fare between the philosophers and the theologians, so to speak. And it is not remotely obvious that the theologians had the better of it. The other thing to realize is that Hume is on the theologian side of that argument, right? He's trying to argue against the possibility of rational theology here in the Christian West in the 1700s, right? But he's doing so with the arguments advanced by the William of Occam's and the El Ghazalis of the High Middle Ages against the possibility of rational knowledge, right? Because back then they thought the impossibility of rational knowledge will issue in the need for positive theology, right, and revelation, not in skepticism, right? Okay. So my basic point is that it is not at all obvious that this argument of Hume's is a particularly strong one, right? It's not completely new. It's not like the philosophers, even in Aquinas's own tradition, hadn't been exposed to it beforehand. Their own positions had heard of it, had already reacted to it, had already assimilated it as a criticism. Aquinas himself is coming well after Averroes and therefore well after Ghazali, right? Well after the incoherence of the incoherence, and his philosophy has already been through this skeptical fire, right? It's not new. Okay. Okay. What does Gilson see here, though? Gilson sees here a reference to immediate experience on the part of Hume that he, Gilson, reads as an appeal to existence against essence. Why? Because to Gilson, the realm of essence and the realm of the mental and confidence in thought are practically synonymous terms, right? In a way, you can think about this as the Pythagoreans and the Platonists already thought that rational knowledge could tell you mathematical knowledge even could tell you something about the machinery behind the world and how it actually works, right? And this skeptical argument is saying you don't really have any reason to be confident that that is the case, right? By the time we're at, the late 19th century versions of this skeptical argument that coming out of people like Nietzsche, right? We will have arrived at the attempts to understand the machinery behind the world rationally are projections of the human mind, which are motions in the brains of a bewildered ape, which may or may not be useful for its purposes, but you should not start from the assumption that they're going to have any chance of being true, right? Something like that. And we got from one to the other, starting from this skeptical attack of Hume and then going through the counter to it of, yes, we don't see causal connections in nature, we put them there, right? And the we put them there, part of that is coming from Kant, right? Okay. The part where Kant is, to me, soundest in the Critique of Pure Reason is when it's describing how the mind works in that putting it there, so to speak. I think he managed to make a pretty good case that we have to think that way. What Kant has never managed to prove, to my satisfaction at least, is that the fact that we have to think that way and the fact that in that sense we're putting it there means it isn't there or means it isn't true, right? That's an entirely different proposition, right? It's just, okay, there's the way in which your understanding of the world is a projection of the necessary understanding of the human mind. Granted, does that mean that that understanding, that projection must be illusory? Not proven. Does it even have any tendency to mean that it is less likely to be true? Not proven. It's extremely likely that the reason why it is adaptive for us to think that way is because it is, at least to a first approximation, very close to true, right? And that's pretty much all the confidence that the Aristotelians had. Leave aside the medievals, right? Aristotle thinks that, natural reason normally goes right because that's what it's for, right? He may be a little bit too teleological about it, and we would think of it more in terms of, evolutionary fitness or something, but still, it mostly goes right. Goes right for the most part, most of the time, is the typical Aristotelian formulation, because it would not be useful otherwise. So it is unlikely that if there's a way that we have to think about the world, it is unlikely that it is completely illusory from that Aristotelian point of view.
Is that a conclusion from inductive reasoning? Seems to me that if that's the way the world works, and we have to think in a way that has evolved, as you mentioned, Darwinianly.
Yeah, it's really a consistency kind of argument, right? It's not a what Hume is looking for is what I would call a criteria kind of argument. He wants there to be a place you can go to check the certificate of where something came from to ensure that it is trustworthy, and so that you can rely with confidence upon the conclusions it leads you to, right? And he thinks when it comes to immediate sense perceptions, he thinks the senses have that. That's what makes him, kind of an empiricist. He thinks when you're just thinking about logic and mathematics, deductive reasoning kind of has that. He has no confidence whatsoever in the cross of the two, right? He's perfectly willing to believe, his senses, and he's perfectly willing to believe mathematical deductions. But if you try to do mathematical deductions about things you see with your senses, he thinks you're, good luck with that, as far as he's concerned, right? Now, he's saying this in the middle of the 19th century, where people are having remarkably good luck with that, so to speak. But he has no confidence in it. But that's because he's looking for something like criteria of certainty from the points of origins of things. Because I got this from the senses, I know that it is true. Because I got this from deductive reasoning, I know that it is true, right? That's very different from consistency arguments. It's very different from this makes sense of all of my experience. This synthesizes all of my experience. The contrary assumption here would result in a very jarring mismatch between how the mind came to be the way it is and how screwed up it is, right? He doesn't. Hume never entertains arguments of that nature. Okay. Okay. But for Kant, this is a useful clue because he's going to discover, what is a useful clue? It's a useful clue for him to understand how the mind works. It sets him off looking for how the mind works without needing to start from the assumption that it must be apodictic, that it must always be right, right? In that sense, he can get closer to we would say the empirical reality of cognitive psychology or something like that, right? Because he's not assuming that the mind is the prior analytics of Aristotle, right? That it is a pure logic machine, right? We're not yet at the point of viewing the mind as an embodied thing or something like that, but he's moving in that direction. Okay. All right, I want to get to the Julius Caesar example because this is there's some things here which are very revealing about Gilson, if I can put it this way. Okay, so did you follow what he was talking about Julius Caesar on 124? This is going to come up again in the next chapter. That's one of the reasons I'm stressing it. We're considering any possible subject. Julius Caesar, for instance, let us suppose it to be posited in the mind of God, right? So there it is with all of its determinations, right? So by the end of this section, it's almost like he wants to say that actual existence is to Julius Caesar one of his essential predicates.
Well, is it essential, or is it an accident that happened and was valid?
This is the point. To a certainly to a wolf, right? Actual existence is an accidental or exterior. It's not even accidental. It's an exterior thing that happens. That actualization actually happens to this Julius Caesar, right? Avicenna would say existence is an accident that befalls this essence, right? But Gilson wants something like that we're talking about actual Julius Caesar is part of the particular essence we're talking about, right? He doesn't.
Is this?
Hang on. Gilson does not want Julius Caesar to be a merely possible subject. Right. He wants the actuality of Julius Caesar to be part of the essence of what we're talking about. Go ahead.
Okay, he's jumping us from timelessness to time, because Julius Caesar did exist at a point in time, and this point comes out later in a different context. Was it Kant or something? Anyway, but the point is that if you just sort of don't make this distinction that Heidegger introduced me to, where something exists because it exists there now, it is.
Yes.
Very nice.
So what's really going on here, I think, is two different notions of possible that it's not clear to me Gilson doesn't have confused, right? So there is possible in the logical necessity sense of possible, and there is possible in the actualization in history sense of possible. And there is an open question how much these could be conflated with one another, right? But I think that sometimes we're finding Gilson actually just confusing the two. What they both have as possible contraries is the realized actual, right? The actual now, right? So before I build a house, the house is a possible house. After I build the house, there's an actual house there. It might not be the same actual house there, or maybe it is the same actual house there, but I didn't have to build it either. If I never did, my plans for it would still have been of a possible house. So the possible house and the actual house don't just have the relationship of one is a non-existent mere mental possibility or something like that. They have two different orders of distinction. One is in the actualization in time or the realization or the instantiation direction, and the other is in the merely possible, truly necessary, or the in-between of them being actualized direction. And this is the version of this distinction that you find in Kant, the last of those, right? This is what he's quoting on page 130. Kant is talking about this in terms of judgments, the different judgments the understanding has about something, in terms of what it means by possible, real, and necessary. But the possible, real, and necessary that Kant is talking about is something is possible if it doesn't involve a contradiction. Something is necessary if it has to follow from the conditions of possible experience, right? The sum of the angles of the three angles of a triangle and a plane have to sum to 180, right? That is necessary. It's not a matter of possible, right? And then there's what he calls the real, but which we would normally call the actual, which is that which coheres with the material conditions of experience. Sensation is real. So Kant is laying out there three different categories in terms of how logically possible something is, so to speak. There's the just involves no contradiction version of possible. At the other extreme, there's the follows from logic alone or the conditions of experience alone necessary, right? And then he puts between them this notion of real, where what he means by it is something like actualized, in the sense that it didn't have to be that way, like the last one where it was logically necessary that occur. It was, but it's more than just that it's possible. It also coheres with sense experience. So this is the position that Kant wants for, if I can put it this way, the actual world line, so to speak, right? So all the possible things that could happen fall in the first possibility thing. The last necessity thing is a set of constraints that everything that happens has to follow, right? But in that sense, there's nothing contingent about them, and there's no freedom or play about them. There's therefore no uncertainty about them. The actualized real in between has to be possible, but it's more than just possible. It's also something which has been actualized that didn't have to be actualized, but has been. Something like that. So these are three different logical relationships that a truth can have to the conditions of experience or to logical necessity, right? Okay. Only the middle one of them has anything to do with actualization, right? Actualization in the sense of drawn from possible to act. Okay. The thing which I see Gilson doing is when he's talking about something like, does Caesar cross the Rubicon, right? He wants something like an actual possible. He wants to use possible not as a term of distinction from the actual. And the essentialists he's arguing against do use possible as a term of distinction from actual, right? For them, the possible house is the not yet actual house, right? The actual house is something else, and they do not have yeah. I definitely see Gilson speaking of possibilities as though they are existence. He wants possibles to be existence. He also wants existences to be if not real predicates, to be something like part of the essence of the thing. Where is this? Right, this is on page 125. In this sense, is no way it applies to existence. If I say Julius Caesar is, I'm not describing a new predicate with an already fully determined notion. I'm positing Julius Caesar absolutely. Yes, okay. Okay, no, that didn't help. So it's the paragraph immediately before that. Inasmuch as it appear possible, the essence of Julius Caesar includes all those predicates that are required for its complete termination, yet qua possible Julius Caesar does not exist. His notion then can be completely determined without including his existence, whence it follows that existence is not a predicate. Common language is here greatly misleading. We say that some regular hexagons exist in nature. We might look as though we are ascribing existence to such things, but common language can easily be corrected as follows. To certain natural objects, such as B cells or rock crystals, for instance, belong the predicates included in the concept of hexagon. He's trying to say it that way to avoid saying that hexagons exist. Thus, instead of ascribing existence to some possible, we correctly ascribe all the predicates of the possible to something that isn't existent. So Gilson's comment is that this is a fine way of explaining what it means, what we signify by existence, but it doesn't explain what existence is. And the problem with that is he's again asking what an existence is. But all the way back to Avicenna, we've heard and been told that existence is not a what, it's a that. So asking what an existence, what existence is a kind of false question, at least for the people he's arguing against, if not for his own doctrine of existence, for theirs. Okay, I'm trying to get at the various ways in which I can see in the specific sections on Kant, Gilson himself being confused. I think this is also going to come out even more in the next chapter, but I'm just throwing it out there. If other people had any problem with this or don't think that he's confused, let me know. I think he is. All right. Questions or thoughts on that before we move on to the Hegel stuff? Four people on mute. Okay, so he correctly goes through Kant's bold stroke that it prescribes to them and explains how this is Kant's way of understanding how necessary connection occurs in our understanding, if not in reality. Okay. Why should understanding not prescribe existence, is asked, because Kant says that would be idealism. But if idealism is true, why not idealism, right? That's the question of 131 that prepares the transition between Kant and Hegel, because Hegel is the guy who answers that question with, why not idealism indeed, and just goes to idealism, right? Yeah, and he says Kantianism thus normally results in neither phenomenalism nor straight idealism, and both may be fruitful subjects. And he's correct that Hegel is the guy who takes Kantianism towards straight idealism. Okay, I tried to give a little bit of an outline of what Hegelian idealism is like. There's a next question of how much more comprehensible does that make any of this stuff going on here in the Hegel discussion? I can start by pulling back to some of the other things we were just talking about, right? Because Hegel is an idealist, he's going to be willing to agree that these things are prescribed by the mind to the world. He's going to still be an essentialist. He's going to see nothing wrong in something being thought-like. Something being thought-like is not to him going to mean that there's something phenomenal about it or something distorted about it. And the result is the particular problems with ontological arguments that you found in Kant aren't going to be there for Hegel. Hegel is going to rehabilitate scholastic ontological arguments of the same kind that the other essentialists from Gilson's point of view used, right? He'll have no problem with them. So he'll have no problem, running straight over Duns Scotus's existence of God argument, for example. So the point is, Hegel is he's not the kind of realist some of these guys in the Middle Ages were, but the idealistic move after Kant has left him in the same position as a lot of the medieval scholastics. Go ahead, Alex.
I'm trying to understand, I think you were mentioning earlier that in a sense, Hegel is radicalizing Humean skepticism.
Yes.
And I'm trying to understand that a little better. So that makes a lot of sense to me because I've heard Hume referred to as an academic skeptic, whereas Hegel picks up on the dialectical skeptics who are a different, probably a more extreme school.
Yeah, and to be clear, Hegel in the end is not a skeptic. He's not, in the end,
right,
he's not but he's willing to start from, if not skepticism, empiricism, right? He just thinks that if you're as empiricist as Hume pretends to be, you're not going to be wondering how thoughts can be true. You're going to be wondering how there can be anything which isn't thought, right? The thing you have immediate evidence for is thought. The notion of external realities, the notion of external objects, the notion of empirical senses, all of those things are deeply derivative notions after layer of conceptual machinery trying to organize your life world. The immediate experience you start from, the immediate data you start from is purely thought-like. So in that sense, Hegel is saying that empiricism is not as materialist a position as the Scottish materialists think it is, or the Scottish empiricists think it is. The Scottish empiricists think that a la Hume and Locke, if you're an empiricist, you're going to be a skeptic and a materialist, right? And Hegel is saying, if you were just a little bit more skeptical, your skepticism would result in you're saying, actually, the only thing I'm sure exists is my mind, right? And its contents. And having started from that, you will then have to derive anything else that you would view as other than or over against that. And you're going to need to have a whole bunch of conceptual machinery in which you have confidence in order to do so. Hume is, without knowing it, relying on a whole bunch of causal efficacy reasoning about the nature of his senses that he's trying to deny with his skepticism, right? He thinks his sense impressions are reliable, but the deductions about connections between them are not. Why does he think his sense deductions are reliable? Why would an image leave a rock outside his head and come into his head, impressed onto his retinas with photons? Why the hell would that happen if causality is a crock? There's no reason for his senses to be reliable. There's no reason for his senses to exist unless there's causality in the world allowing the external world to impress itself upon his mind. Before he has confidence in causality, all he's got is his mind. There isn't any external reality pressing on it until he has a notion of an inside and an outside and pressing, all of which are causal notions, right? So that's putting some of these things in, I'm putting some words into Hegel's mouth. The thing he's actually doing is he's starting from the immediate contents of consciousness and saying, this is the phenomenal data that all theories have to explain, skeptical or otherwise. And as soon as they start trying to explain it, rather than just leaving it there, they're going to be engaging in reasoning in which, if they don't have confidence, it's going to be because their later reasoning overturns some piece of their earlier reasoning. But they're going to be reasoning, right? And they're going to be following the train of their deductions and, running with their wild guesses or their deductions. There's no choice in the matter. If they don't do that, where they start from will be where they end, and where they start from is not skepticism or materialism or empiricism. Where they start from is, my mind is everything, and the world consists of my thoughts. Go ahead, Alex.
So I guess the way that translates into this formal equivalence that you were mentioning between, so Kant, following Hume, had said there is an X outside of me, there is this object which gives me sense data in some unknowable way, and I can't know anything about it but that it is a kind of thatness or a kind of there. It's just out there, and here, that's all. That's as far as I can go.
So
and Hegel is challenging that assumption and saying, what you're calling this X is actually our own consciousness, and
right,
there is a kind of and then that will become also this absolute spirit.
Right. So 134. This is from Hegel's Encyclopedia, right? What is this given, right? There's a prerequisite for knowledge, right? Such as the thing in itself, and Hegel calls it the total abstract, the empty whole, without any further determination than that of a beyond, right? That's what the given is for him, and what Hegel will say to that is, you're just saying that to be is to be perceived, right? And what Hegel says is that Kantian thing in of itself is completely indistinguishable from the absolute idealism of Berkeley. What he says is needed to get beyond this is concrete universals, that is, concrete essences adequately grasped through concrete concepts. And this is the point where Gilson can't entirely follow what Hegel means by the concrete here, right, or concrete universals. When Hegel is talking about concrete universals, he's talking about a universalized, no restrictions version of experience, right? So wholly concrete totality in all of its possible determinations. And wholly concrete totality in all its possible determinations is indistinguishable from thought as such. meaning all possible thought, right? The indeterminacy of the X of the thing in itself is formally equivalent to all possible thought, which is not the notion of an exterior thing. It's the bare concept of an unknown that can be filled with anything that could happen, which is the mind. So that's the move that Hegel makes on Kant. He first says that you think that you're not an idealism, but you're indistinguishable from Berkeleian idealism, which is the solipsist version of idealism. And as soon as you try to be more general than that, and you try to be more general than your mind, and you try to get to mind as such, you're going to end up with a all possible thought. And that all possible thought is going to be as undetermined, as indeterminate and infinite a potential as your unknown X. So the reality that you're prescribing as behind thoughts about things and all possible thoughts about things are the same thing. You wanted to put it in a different place, but you were the thing that you were putting that different place was possible object of my thought. That's what it was as an act, to put it in the place of the unknown X. You put it in the place of possible object of my thought. That's the only place you put things, right? And all possible objects of your thought is the same as saying it's just your mind viewed as something which you're trying to refer with, as opposed to the thing which is doing the referring. And Hegel's point is it is always already both, right? There is no place for that objective X outside the mind without the mind treating it as its object. Only the relation between them is real. Okay.
So one thing about Gilson's reading of Hegel, so he seems to read him as an essentialist.
Yes.
Of a certain sort, and that to me was a little problematic, because I guess I would want to say, sure, Hegel is in a sense bringing the Wolffian style rationalism to bear on Hume, but he's also doing the reverse, and he is bringing this Humean empiricism, kind of marrying it with rationalism. And I would want to say, as much as Hegel is an essentialist, he's also an existentialist. And
so he
is
is
evidence of that.
Go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, just a whole account of history, of historical development, of the stages of the dialectic.
Sure.
So it kind of seems like it's a marriage of the two, much more complete than Kant wanted.
Yes, and it's
Or
not
could
even
allow,
and it's not even really just a marriage. I mean, you're right that there's this dialectical notion. He's not like Wolff in the sense that he is not nearly as logically consistent as Wolff, right? He is perfectly happy to play with flat contradictions that would drive Wolff batty, right? Wolff wants logical clarity and consistency in everything, right? So he's an essentialist who contradicts himself, which is what essentialists are almost always trying not to do, right? So in that sense, he's not like an essentialist. This is where you're right that there's this dialectical aspect of them, this becoming aspect to him. What's really going on in Hegel is that he's following trains of thought, and he's noticing that these changing and switching trains of thought are the activity of spirit. They're the characteristic activity of spirit. And the characteristic activity of spirit is not logically consistent, except in the sense that it succeeds itself with one position after another, right? The positions that succeed one another successively in the thoughts of the interior of consciousness are, how to put it? They are very far from being a consistent system deduced from one principle from the get-go, right? They evolve by trial and error, by wild generalization and noticing how it doesn't fit. right? And this is the famous, dialectical reason that Hegel didn't invent. He actually got it from Fichte. It's there in the Science of Knowledge in Fichte. But the right way to think about it as a methodology is Hegel is imagining someone starting from anything that they can possibly experience and imagining that it's the entire truth. And they make the assumption that what I had previously understood is the entire truth. And then they'll notice some contradiction between that assumption and some aspect of their experience or some aspect of reality. And every time there is such a jarring hole, it will stick out and worry them, and they will revise their scheme in a way to incorporate that fact. And the result is that the scheme gets more and more elaborate and spins out more and more elaborate towers of distinction in the interior of consciousness. And to Hegel, that process is the process of the unfolding of thought. It's also the process of thought and history. It's the history of spirit, so to speak. And for him, mind exists by having a history like that, right? That's what mind is like. Mind is not like Euclidean geometry, right? Okay, so the ways in which that is kind of an existential move is the fact that there is this starting from the phenomenological interior of experience, which you also get in sort of later existentialism. And there is this focus on the subjective pole, right? That's not existent in the sense of the doctrine of essence and existence that we were getting, from the medievals. It is a lot more like modern existentialism in the sense of what am I trying to say? This phenomenological move is there at the beginning, both in Hegel and in modern existentialism. Both of them tend to start from the interior of consciousness and try to understand the structures of thought or the world from that evidence, right? They're interior of the life world, subjective pole thinking kinds of philosophies, right? So in that respect, you're right that Hegel is not simply a Wolffian essentialist. Partly that's because he's such an idealist, but he doesn't think that he is thinking about the external metaphysical structures, right? He thinks he's thinking about thought. The other thing, which is sometimes curious / off-putting, hard to take or hard to understand in Hegel, is how superficial he sometimes is, if I can put it this way, in the sense that you cannot believe he means what he just said, right? But he does. Right? He's saying something, transparently, crazy and weird, but he cannot possibly mean it. Is there some hidden meaning behind it? Nope, there isn't. He means it. But he's also the part where Gilson is right that he feels so essentialist is that he's incredibly abstract, right? He's reasoning about these entire categories, these huge generalities, which he's treating as just counters for thought and also as the external things themselves indifferently, and he sees no slippage between them. Gilson thinks that when you've proven that something is mental, you have probably proven that it's delusory and unreal, and Hegel is exactly the opposite. Right? He thinks that when you've proven that something is mental, you've proved that it's Tuesday. Right? Everything is. So he has no animus against the abstract. And that's part of what Gilson is detecting. He has no distrust of the abstract, right? Whereas Hume, Kant, Gilson share this kind of distrust of the abstract, if I can put it that way, of the exhaustiveness yeah, something like that, the exhaustiveness of the abstract. Okay, let's get on to Kierkegaard for a second, because this is related to this issue of the reaction to how abstract it is. Hegel thinks that his, this working out of the content of absolute reality by reason alone, and giving issuing in a new version of a rational theology, right? He thinks that that's going to be, it's a perfectly a complete rationalism to Hegel, although how rational is, might be disputed by some. But Kierkegaard's reaction to it is how to put it? He thinks it's pure abstraction. So this is the point on was it page 144? Where is it? Right. The claim is that what Hegel regards as concreteness itself is to Kierkegaard completely abstract, the opposite of concrete. Yes, abstraction itself drives that actual contradiction. Hegel overcame contradiction so easily that there's no contradiction at all in the order of abstraction. Right? Yeah. What's the fundamental thought in this thing in Kierkegaard? I mean, there's a couple curious things. One is you have to realize that Kierkegaard does treat Hegel as philosophy, right? He's not saying this is why Hegel's philosophy is wrong and we should replace it with another philosophy. He basically calls Hegel the system at times, and he regards Hegelian philosophy and philosophy as almost synonymous, but he is completely dissatisfied with it. But his dissatisfaction with Hegel is also his dissatisfaction with philosophy. What he contrasts with Hegelian supposed rationalism is subjective knowledge. So his claim is that philosophy can be objective knowledge, but objective knowledge doesn't care whether or not the person thinking it understands anything about it. Objective knowledge, in a way, can exist in books. It can exist as words on pages. It can exist as, logical relations among chains of propositions, right? It doesn't matter whether or not it has been assimilated. It doesn't matter whether or not a mind comprehended it or was moved by it, or whether or not it reached an interior consciousness in any sense. So that's the category that Kierkegaard wants to claim Hegel has not done justice to, is what Kierkegaard is calling subjective knowledge. Such knowledge as requires the actual assimilation by this particular individual mind in order to be what it is, right? And he has, plenty of examples of that. These are the tropes of later existentialism, right? Can you give me a rational proof that you're in love? No, you just have to subjectively know it, right? If you don't subjectively know it, it's not real, right? So anything of that character, Kierkegaard claims, has no place in Hegel's system, can't fit in Hegel's system. Hegel's system is too rational and, in a way, too abstract and dissected for those kinds of things to fit into it. And his Kierkegaard's primary claim is that, by the way, that includes all of religion. You can have all of the rational proofs of whatever you want, and all of the dogmatics you want, but if all of it is just a dissected abstract thing, there isn't an ounce of religion in it. Okay, so just first reactions to the where Kierkegaard is in all this. Preferably not from Joe.
I was fishing for my button here.
I'm looking
I
for
was
a reaction.
intrigued.
Go ahead. You go ahead and be intrigued.
No, how he's the one that actually was able to come back at Hegel. I think subjective knowledge is a very important concept. I mean, I like it. Good observation. Was he really the first in all the time? Well, I suppose he is. But he wanted to do it because his subjective knowledge that, you know, said you can't show rationally you're in love. And one important he made was that you also can't show rationally that I'm not saved. I am saved. That's my subjective knowledge of it. Isn't it?
Sure, although he does not have such knowledge. That's his problem. Okay, so
I like the distinction that he makes between in German, aufhehen has this both meaning both to suppress something and to preserve it, which
yeah, that's Hegel. That's already Hegel. But
right.
The thing he's talking about in 144, right, in the relationship between the lover thing and the philosophy thing, right, is he speaks of philosophers as lovers of wisdom, right? Kierkegaard points out that people saw people walking around in Greek and Roman cities, and you could meet a strange-looking man, and you could say, "Here comes the philosopher." You could tell because they looked different, they acted different, they dressed differently. They wanted to be philosophers. They didn't want to be mere knowers or teachers of wisdom, right? It means that a philosopher is a lover. Do we call a man a lover who knows everything about love but is not in love? Love's knowledge and to be in love are one and the same thing. The knowledge of philosophy is to be a philosopher, just as Socrates was. Socrates, who never wrote a thing in all his life, but who was the very love of wisdom, walking around the streets and places of Athens. Right? So the philosophy that would be of any interest to Kierkegaard is the philosophy that would be not wisdom, but love of wisdom, heavy accent on the love part, which would mean that it would be the subjective knowledge part of it that is the important part of it. Okay. So, and the claim then is that if that interior life world subjective knowledge love life, so to speak, if I can put it that way, can be called in shorthand existence. The claim is that there can be a system of knowledge, but there cannot be a system of existence. Whereby a system, he means something like Hegel's encyclopedia of this, tower of rational doctrine, right? Okay. So, and I think this is, first of all, as an argument against what is, not against, as an argument that puts its finger on what is unsatisfactory in Hegel, this is very good, right? Because Hegel does have this abstract, desiccated, almost disembodied feel to it. Even though it's trying to talk about the interior of consciousness and the interior of the life world, it's talking about it in this whirlwind way that is never where anyone is ever actually already stuck, right? Or actually stuck, right? People might be at some point along this way. They're not just in the whirlwind along the way. They're certainly not having completed the entire tour of the whirlwind along the way and then, pulling up their cape with a flourish, like Hegel seems to be, right? Hegel looks like an actor, right? This is why he's sometimes called a sophist, right? He looks like he's playing at being the philosopher. He's playing the part of a philosopher on stage. He's, you know, doing all the dramatic gestures about how I can explain everything with his, with, you know, and waving his cloak. But you get the sense that it's for show, right? And, you know, and Kierkegaard, you know, just points at him and says, you know, that's all very well, but, you know, you're not in love, I can tell. And that's why this is so easy for you, right? That's why you can explain everything away. In a way, he has the he is a more passionate and religious version of the Voltairean cynics attitude towards Leibniz. You know, this is the point you were making about the only thing you know about Leibniz is what you heard from Candide, right? It's the best of all possible worlds. Oh, really? Are we going to go tell that to the victims of the Lisbon earthquake, right? So that's Voltaire's reaction to the Leibnizian rationalism, right? And it's kind of Kierkegaard's reaction to Hegelian's claim of rationalism too, right? So he sees Hegel's whole system. He says, "Oh, so that's what Christianity means to you. You consider yourself a Lutheran, do you? Right? This doctrine of how everything is absolute spirit created by the mind, and this disembodied sort of mind thing, thinking all the thoughts of the history of philosophy through all its history. That's what you mean by the absolute spirit, and you think is the same as the Lutheran God." This doesn't look at all to me like Lutheranism. This doesn't look at all to me like Christianity at all, right? This looks to me like, you know, something very different from all that. Above all, something, you know, way too rational, way too pat, that thinks that the real is the rational when I see the absurd everywhere. You know, I see suffering and men's, you know, direct relation to God, and you have a pat answer for everything instead, right? So that's the point that Gilson is making about this is a kind of a cry of dissatisfaction with the supposedly exhaustive rational explanation of things, right? One way to think about it is Hegel set out to completely reconcile reason and revelation, and at the end of it, Kierkegaard looked at it and says, "I don't see a scrap of revelation in that thing," right? All I see is reason, and it's not all that reasonable, right? So and as a you know, pot calling the kettle, pointing the finger at Hegel, whatever, I think that's fine. That you can ask whether or not there are elements of Kierkegaard himself which are indebted to Hegel and in some ways as formulaically abstract as Hegel, right? His formal contradictions, his, you know, the formality of his concept of the subject, right? His notion of the supposed contradiction between temporal existence and eternity, right? Many of these things are things which he has discovered or played on exactly the same dialectic register of contradiction that you find in Hegel, right? It's just that instead of smoothly reconciling every contradiction, he's, you know, harping on each one and, you know, pulling them apart and either oring them until they can, you know, ring the bells, so to speak. But it's still the same formal structure, and there's still an incredible degree of abstraction in some of it. Even though he's trying to insist upon, you know, being more concrete, the things he's insisting upon as concrete are, you know, giant abstractions like finitude and eternity, right? That are in a way as big as the categories of Hegel's encyclopedia.
I have a quick question sort of related to that.
Sure.
Hopefully not too off topic, but as you were talking, I was thinking about, Kierkegaard talks about the aesthetic and the ethical and the religious. Is that basically, could you just view that within as a Hegelian dialectic, or is it somehow different? Is it not that the religious reconciles the other two, or how do you see that?
I don't think that Kierkegaard, thinks that it reconciles them, right? I think some of that goes back to Kant and the second and third critiques and the places where Kant left room for something which is other than simply the rational. And so Kierkegaard was, interested in exploring those, the ethical in the second critique and the sublime and the beautiful in the third critique. But for of those, the category that the religious winds up corresponding to for him is the sublime and not the ethical at all. I think this is especially true especially clear in his understanding of the Isaac story, right? For Kierkegaard, religion is not within the ethical, and the ethical is on a lower plane. You don't even get that in Kant. Kant doesn't actually have a lower plane for those moral things. There is a notion of the sublime in the third critique, which can in some ways point beyond, you can put it this way, the merely moral, but it never contradicts it for Kant. For Kierkegaard, it contradicts it, right? He'll tell you flat out at the end of the Isaac story that viewed morally, Abraham is a murderer, right? And the question is whether or not that matters more to you, right? And to a pure Kantian, it should and would. He's not one. So that's part of this love of paradox, love of contradiction that you get in Kierkegaard, which I see as being much more like Hegel and much less like Kant. He's starting from the same things, but he seeks the contradiction and wants to heighten it. He never wants to, smooth it over or reconcile it. He's seen too many flip reconciliations in Hegel to like them anymore.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that might be why it's it's a leap into the religious. It's not like a smooth transition from, like a dialectical transition from the ethical onto the religious. It's an abrupt, disjunctive leap.
He honestly doesn't want religion to be reasonable. If a religion was reasonable, it would bore the crap out of him, right? And that certainly was something brand new in the 19th century, right? Almost all the earlier philosophical thinkers had been concerned to play up to the degree of compatibility between religion and religion. And if someone was downplaying it, it tended to be from the reason side, right? And Kierkegaard is a new rhetorical note in the sense that he's saying, don't you dare bring any of that reason over here near me, right? And the closest I've seen to that earlier, it would be someone like Ghazali, actually. Occam to a much lesser extent, but Ghazali, you find that in Ghazali too. Alex?
Yeah, just a question about the relationship of Kierkegaard to Hume. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if Kierkegaard was particularly influenced actually by Hume, but something interesting in this text that at one point, Gilson calls Hume an empirical existentialist or an empiricist existentialist or something like that. And that was really interesting to me because I know Kierkegaard obviously is called an existentialist. And it seems like there's actually some pretty close affinity on some level between the two. Hume, of course, was interested in science and in questions around physics and causality and so on, which is not Kierkegaard's real focus. But it seems like on a deeper level, there might actually be a lot of affinity. And what was interesting to me, and I guess connecting to Gilson as well, that it seems that existence can be thought in terms of sensible things, billiard balls and rocks and, material objects. But then we can also think of existence in a non-sensible way. And I have this sense that Gilson will go into that direction with his Aquinian existentialism, maybe. But this was my question, like, are we seeing some of that with Kierkegaard, that there is something like an so that existentialism basically can be empiricist, having to do with things, or it can be somehow higher. Yeah.
So we have to distinguish between the things that are really there in modern existentialism or in Kierkegaard as a precursor to modern existentialism, and the use of the word existential here by Gilson on someone like Hume, right? Hume is not an existentialist by any stretch of the imagination, right? The place where he's calling Gilson is saying Hume is appealing to existence. What he really means is actuality, right? He's appealing to the actual as against the conceptual, as against the essential, as against the abstract, right? And Gilson likes that, and he sees that as being of a piece with these other later existentialists. But what's fundamentally going on for Hume there is he's trying to appeal to empirical actuality, right? And the thing that Gilson is picking up on is the fact that that's pointing to an in-timeness of human life that has a givenness to it, and we would later say a thrownness to it, and a not understanding everything about where it is to it, right? So the point of commonality is dealing with an unknown givenness, right? And the concept that connects the two is actuality, right? Actuality as experienced finite being in time, something like that, right? That's what the Humean empiricist skeptic, right, is focusing on as against Aristotelian or Platonic towers of abstraction, and that the Kierkegaardian is also focusing on as the not fully comprehended, not fully rational life world, or as that a Heidegger will think of as thrownness or the givenness of things, whatever. All of them are pointing to something like an actuality in time, and that's what this use of the existence word is doing here, right? It's picking out that actuality pole, that in-timeness pole, that givenness pole that is being distinguished from many different versions of something more mind-like, systemized, abstract, or essentialist than that, right? But I don't think that's because there's some deep affinity of the empiricist skepticist view and that other existentialism. I think there's the other existentialism is fundamentally much more at home in a if I can put it this way, in a subjectivist mentalist world, in a world that would make sense to an idealist, so to speak. And Hume is not. Hume has the least trust for those things of anything, right? So Hume is much more inclined to trust his senses than to trust deductive judgments or deductive reasoning, but he's more likely to trust either than to trust feelings, for example, right? He is a enlightenment rationalist that way, of a very deep hue, right? The primary things he's trying to overthrow as possible are: 1, natural religion; 2, any too excessive faith in deductive reasoning, or deductive rationalism. And both of them in the name of a kind of skeptical, we don't know very much, limited claims position of we only have half-assed probabilities to go on in our in which for which empiricism in our senses is our best light, something like that. So he is inclined to pull in the horns of what you can know, but there's no sentimentalism, if I can put it that way, in Hume. There's no concern with the life world in Hume at all. He'd be more concerned with commerce than the life world. But in that way, he's closer to Locke, if I can put it that way, than to someone like Kierkegaard. So I think that they're in this context, they're looking closer to one another just because they have certain opposites in common. I do think that they have certain that those opposites also wind up resulting in some shared arguments. This is why it's curious that Ghazali and Hume use the same arguments 500 years apart and 600 years apart in two entirely different civilizations from entirely different positions within the civilizations, and critiquing entirely different groups within their civilizations. But they still use the same arguments. Anyway, I don't know if that helps, but to me, Hume is not an existentialist at all. They are sharing something like this focus on or emphasis on the givenness of things, and especially the givenness of actuality, which to one is empiricism and to the other is something more like focus on the life world and things of immediate import to the individual, something like that. Fair question, though. Okay. How much do people know about? I mean, I know that several people here know Kierkegaard pretty well, but I'm sure that others don't. Are there questions about just what Kierkegaard's actual positions in any of these things are?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out, but my ignorance is vast.
I see. It is fair to call it starting point of modern existentialism. For example, there's we saw that all of the medievals down to Wolff all believed that some version of rational theology made sense and could prove things about God by reason alone, right? Kierkegaard has completely thrown that over, right? So there's a complete acceptance of the Kantian demolition of ontological arguments in Kierkegaard, and he's cheering about it for the opposite reason, right? He's not cheering about it because he wants natural theology to be overthrown, but because he doesn't want people to be religious for rational reasons. If they're religious, they should be religious for irrational reasons, or for more passionate reasons, more personal reasons, not for impersonal, logical, deductive reasons. If that makes sense. And there's no question that has been influential in a lot of later 19th and 20th century modern theology, probably especially Protestant theology. But and it's noteworthy here that although Gilson is sympathetic to some of those anti-Hegelian aspects of Kierkegaard, so to speak, into some of the existentialist aspects of Kierkegaard. He's not sympathetic to that aspect, right? This is where you're going to see why Gilson is not a Kierkegaardian himself. I want to jump to that for a second because I think it's important to make sure we see that. What did he say? There's a place where he says that there's a cost for this, right? What do you say? Where is it? Yes. One could hardly wish for a knowledge more free from all the mixture of objectivity, and after such a devastating criticism, the magnificently ordered world of Hegelian essences is a wreck. But there is a heavy bill to pay. Perfectly safe in the possession of subjective existence, will Kierkegaard be able to reach another existence than his own? In other words, to what can we rightly ascribe existence outside the only being which we experience from within? If you only have subjective knowledge of yourself, right, are you going to be able to reach the other, so to speak? So this is a point that Gilson is himself worried about. He's worried that Kierkegaard has gone so far off the subjective pole post-Kant that he's not going to get back to any objective realism, right? If we cannot reach reality through the abstract notion of existence, can we at least compare between themselves two or more actually existing subjects? Scarcely. They're non-comparable. Each particular man is alone, Kierkegaard says. Right? So there is a, Gilson himself is not Kierkegaardian because he's worried that the Kierkegaardian opening towards existentialism is going to be too subjectivist and too irrationalist in some cases, not realist enough, and is going to isolate the human subjects from each other, so to speak. He also thinks that Kierkegaard sees there as being too much of a paradox or contradiction between human understanding and eternity. He's enamored of paradoxes of that sort. And Gilson doesn't think there's a paradox in that, which he'll get to in his later chapter. The point that I'm trying to make is that despite his sympathies for him in the context of the immediate fights he's in, Gilson is not coming out on Kierkegaard's side in all this, right? He's more on his side than he is on Hegel's side, that's for sure. But he doesn't think that Kierkegaard is just the answer here. He's not realist or rational enough for Gilson. Any other?
I just want to comment on that.
Sure.
Sorry. I just want to comment on that because that struck me as curious what he was suggesting, that Kierkegaard kind of tends towards solipsism or something like that. Because I kind of can see his argument, but that's definitely not the sense that I get from Kierkegaard. And almost, for me at least, a rationalism or something like that, it doesn't really solve the problem. Knowledge doesn't connect you to the other, right? But the kind of subjective knowledge or experience that Kierkegaard talks about does connect you to the other. And I see that coming to fruition with Buber later on with the I-thou relationship. That's a kind of subjective knowledge that Kierkegaard is talking about and kind of preparing for. And so to me, Kierkegaard kind of leads the way to that, and anything more abstract or more rationalistic kind of closes the door.
So I think that it's fair to say that that's what Kierkegaard wants, but it's not clear that it's what he achieves, right? Kierkegaard wants the sharing of the subjective and real communication and real communion, etc., to be coextensive, to one lead to the other. But there is an abstract separation in him, which is pretty absolute, and its fundamental drivers are not emotional. They're not psychological. They're abstract, right? They're abstract and formulaic, and I can, you can easily see ways in which Kierkegaard is. It's almost like he knows what he's supposed to do in order to have an emotional connection to things, and then laments the fact that he doesn't actually do them. So he will say, "This is what Christianity is, and I'm not a Christian," right? He will say, it's absurd for the modern world to think that it's Christian, and if they were Christians, they would truly love each other, and you can tell that they don't because look at what jerks they are, right? And the point is, you get this condemnation poured out upon the whole church of the modern world for its fakeness from a man who is preaching the importance of charity. You get this. You get these paeans to love from a man who left his only love in his life, right? So there is some of this sense of isolation in Kierkegaard. You can tell that he doesn't want to be isolated. You can tell that he is striving for exactly the kind of connection that you talk about in the Berberian sense, so to speak. But that he achieves it is much less obvious. What he does manage to achieve is a kind of extremely forceful clarity about the isolation which is there beforehand, if I can put it that way. But yeah, Kierkegaard is a challenging guy. Very different from a lot of these others. He's certainly different from Aquinas. If I compare
Isn't
him,
there a sense in which,
sorry?
Isn't there a sense in which his biography bears out that same sense? I mean, that's one of the things my philosophy professor always said is never read a philosopher without looking at a picture of him and reading his biography. And I think Kierkegaard was a very, very real example of that because his whole life he lived in that struggle, and so he was almost autobiographical in many senses, more so than I see in other philosophers.
Yes, and you would hope that an existentialist, subjectivist philosopher would manage to have the struggles of his life and the in some sort of close and tense harmony with his thought, right? But it almost, in his case, looks like it's the other way, right? It's the tension in his thought driving a bunch of the tragedies of his life, if I can put it that way. And I don't mean tragedies in the sense of happenstance to him. I mean in terms of what he did and didn't accomplish in the things that mattered most to him, which weren't about writing. Right? He accomplished
Exactly.
plenty. He accomplished plenty in writing, but yeah. Fair question. I just want to point out that if I compare a character like Kierkegaard, that's the right way of putting it, or even some of the later theologians in his train, with the Aquinas, Scotus, Avicenna, Suarez, sort of people of the world, right? They are sober, square, non-passionate, worldly, accomplished intellectuals by comparison. They are most of the things that Kierkegaard was wont to denounce about the superficial worldly theologians of his day, or the too abstract philosophers a la Hegel. Most of them had all of that in spades. It didn't stop them from being, by their own lights and in their own time, thought of as entirely not just influential philosophers, but more than that, as they were looked upon as leaders and moral teachers and examples and all those other usual things, right? While also being, examples of the complete compatibility of a kind of very strident rationalism with their religion, right? They were not walking contradictions between those things. Quite the opposite. Whereas those things seem like they have to be in contradiction with one another when you're looking at a Kierkegaard and a Hegel next to each other, right? You feel like a unified human being has been cut in half, right? You have the Hegel half and the Kierkegaard half walking about, hopping around on one leg each, right? And you look back at the scholastics and you see whole human beings with both legs, right? Anyway, it's just my impression of a little bit of that. I'll also say that something like the rhetorical temperature is clearly rising. There's plenty of debates among these professors and theologians, but from Avicenna to Wolff, they're also all agreeing on critical essentials about core questions of metaphysics, right? But by the early 19th century, they're almost separating into camps that are ready to go out at hammer and tongs, right? Now, this is partly misleading. There's plenty of going at it hammer and tongs in the Middle Ages too. It was just often, different people than the ones we're reading. It was Ghazali going after, Averroes, or the hierarchy going after all of them, or whatever. They had their own partisan knockdown dragouts. It's just noteworthy that at the sort of intellectual peaks, there was a kind of less campiness, if I put it that way, than we see maybe post Kant. Now, to be fair, Kant is taking seriously people from all these traditions, right? He's kind of in a way at a point where all of these are still talking to each other. He will not look upon a human and say, he's giving an argument which is contrary to mine, so I won't take him seriously, right? He's trying to take them all seriously. But by the time we're into the 19th century, let alone the late 19th century, many of these people are moving towards making arguments that are dismissive of each other's positions instead of trying to assimilate and incorporate each other's positions. Anyway, that may partly be perspective in the sense that we notice the differences that are still alive closer to our time, and it may be that if you go back to 1277 and the condemnations of 1277, it would have looked as to Sigurd of Brabant, all of whose works were just outlawed by the Academy, right? It would have looked as contentious as you please, right? Very likely that's the case, but okay. I've gotten through the stuff I wanted to get through, but I want to give you guys a chance to ask your questions and your if there are particular things you want to focus back on. Let's do that first. Gabrielle, I feel like you were about to ask something.
Kind of. I was going to ask Craig, actually. You mentioned a couple of things at the beginning, one of which is that you feel like Gilson was kind of strawmanning Kant. And I was just wondering if that was basically what Jason covered already, or if there are other examples of that. And then the second thing I think is that you were particularly interested in what he said about Kierkegaard. And again, I was just wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that.
I think both of them have been covered. At this point, I still have a fondness for Kierkegaard based on my own history, but I also realize there's there's always our own past in terms of looking at that. The part in Kant that helped too was having taken a course in philosophy of religion where we spent a lot of time on all the arguments for the existence of God, but they were somewhat out of context. It was Frederick Farray's book that we used as a source book, and the philosophy teacher was a former Baptist minister, so it had a slant to it, to put it mildly. And I think the sorting out of a little bit more of the history was quite helpful, and a little bit of putting it more into perspective of what happened to the ontological arguments, and then how they got revived was a very important part of looking back and trying to put some of the pieces together on that. So I think both of those were covered.
Great. So Alex, do you perhaps have anything we haven't gotten to? I can't tell because you're on mute and hiding. If not, I'm going to move on to a little bit of preview, and then we can talk about when. Fundamental preview, right? So being in existence, the next chapter, we're also going to do knowledge in existence, which is the last. The knowledge in existence is shorter. In a way, it's trying to be a more, put it this way, a more mainstream and kind of linguistic philosophy summing up of things. Whereas chapter 5 is really the meat of his own position. And the meat of his own position is trying to be an explication of what he takes to be Aquinas's position on the real distinction between essence and existence. But some things to track through it. One is, how much is the Aquinas there clearly the Aquinas of 1270, and how much of it is an Aquinas that's already been informed by this whole history, right? His own Aquinas. Another is, does he want existence to wind up being something like an essential predicate? Does he want existence inside essence? Because that's not what you get in Aquinas itself, but it might be something like what Gilson wants, in the sense that he has objections to notions of essence that exclude actuality or actualization from the essence of things. Something to track if you read the chapter is what I'm trying to say. Remain open to the possibility that Aquinas's notion of what existence is and how it is really distinguished from essence might be more of a piece of the scholastic philosophy of the Middle Ages that he's worried about than it is of Gilson's contemporary concerns, right? Okay. The other thing to track is what Gilson thinks of as the contraries of existence. Existence as opposed to what, right? And what does he assimilate to essence? Are the things which he tends to assimilate to essence the same things that Aquinas assimilates to essence? Okay. In all of that, you should also just pay attention to what he does to explicate Aquinas's own position on the role of existence and essence and substance, because I think that that basic notion he's right about, that he has a way in which he refers to, how to put this, existence is to the substance as the form is to the matter, something like that. That's a kind of formula that you get in Aquinas, which makes an Aristotelian sense, so to speak. And you have to track why Aquinas isn't simply an Aristotelian on the point. What do the actual original Aristotelians think on the point? What do the actual substance thinking Aristotelians think about actualization and on the one hand and existence on the other? Because Aquinas is not simply agreeing with Aristotle, and it's important to understand why. Right? And Gilson is right to point out that he's not simply agreeing with him, but it's also important to understand why. And Gilson doesn't always get all that Aristotle perfectly right. The place where I think you have to pay the most attention to Gilson is what he thinks the relationship is between actuality, being an act, and existence. Because he's the place where he is stumped for the greatest importance of scholasticism having left something essential behind is when he said that the Suarezian notion of existence was completely inadequate, and you had to go back to the Aquinian one to get the real thing. The Suarezian notion is that it is the actuality of the essence. So track the ways in which he's departing from that, right? What's his beef with Suarez? What's his beef with either the Avicennian, an accident that befalls substance, or the Suarezian, the actualization of the essence notion of existence? And how clear is he about why he disagrees with that? Okay, that's sort of the philosophically medius thing in the coming chapter. The other thing to just assess is he's giving you this giant history in which there's been, hiding in the background the idea that there's some, solution that's going to solve all of these problems, get everything to click into place, make all of this clear, and point the way to the correction that, makes all of this better. Can he deliver? Does he deliver? Do you come out of the chapter with a sense that he has clarified everything that was unclear and solved all the problems we have had since chapter 1, right? So, he's written a lot of checks. Can he cash them? Right. So that's the other thing to assess in the chapter. I admire the attempt. I admire the ambition. I think he's been a great guide to a lot of, very detailed and interesting history. But he's got a tough row to hoe to fulfill on everything he's promised, so to speak, in one chapter. So hold him to it, right? You can be as sympathetic as you like afterwards, but hold him to it to see if he can really do it, because it's not boasting if you can do it, right? Okay. So yeah, that's my suggestions for preparations for the next chapter and change. And because the next chapter is so much weightier than the one after it in a way, and the one after it is so much shorter, I don't think it makes sense to have an extra session for just chapter 6. So we're going to do all of chapters 5 and 6 for our next session. Okay. The other thing to realize here is now there are still people involved but the people involved are no longer, 7 different philosophers you have to track. The people you have to worry about are Gilson, Aquinas, Aristotle. Yes, the other people you've met along the way, but the main people to track here is, what does Aristotle think? What does Aquinas think? What does Gilson think? Okay.
And Gilson doesn't tell you what he thinks. You just have to infer it, correct?
No, he'll tell you what he thinks. He just won't tell you any place where he and Aquinas differ. But he'll tell you what he thinks. You'll have to notice if it's not the same thing Aquinas thinks, because Gilson thinks that it is. Okay. Okay. He'll also speak about the errors of Kierkegaard. Pay a little bit of attention to that. But anyway, it's a good chapter. It's worth reading. All right. Any questions about what we're going to get in the last, or do we want to talk about when we should do? We're talking, so leaving aside the appendix, we're going from 154 to 215. So that's like 70 pages, a little bit longer than some of the others. I don't know if that means people want 3 weeks as opposed to 2 weeks. I could do 3 or 2. Do people have a preference between the 31st of January or the 7th of February for this next one?
I have no preference between the two. The greater length simply means that I procrastinate for a shorter period before I buckle down.
Right. Craig, does either of those not work? January 31st or February 7th, those both work?
They both look okay now. Yeah.
Okay. Alex, do you have a preference?
Either one is fine for me.
Either one, okay. And Gabriel, you say
Does
either one is.
If
If
Jim have a preference?
It's a question, but if nobody here has a preference, I'm going to go for the 31st, just so we can get it done. I have one other major topic. I don't know how major, but I have one other topic. Let's schedule it for the 31st. That's the first point. The next point is that's going to be our last session on Gilson. What do you guys want to do next? I'm taking suggestions. I mean, I've got lots of ideas, but what do you guys want to do next?
In my other philosophy group, the next reading is a journal article from Carnap, whom I had never heard of. And I'm not trying to suggest anything related to that, except that's what I'm doing on the side. So between now and February 31st or February 7th, both, because I'll be aiming toward like the first Monday in February to finish that one.
Yes. I got it. This should be something that we would be at this point just looking to get a book on or something, and then not reading until in February to actually meet about like February 14th or 21st or something like that. So I'm not that interested in Carnap, but
I'm not trying to suggest.
I understand. But in terms of things which would be sensible segues from what we've done here, right? One possibility is there's some of the things that were there in the this Ancients and Questions of Being, Ancients and Medievals and Questions of Being, which we could go back to a different work of Heidegger for. I don't know if people are interested in that, but there's the challenging Heidegger on Plato's Sophist. As one possibility. Another is we could, we went through a ton of this stuff in the medievals that people didn't know about, and I don't know if anyone is interested enough in one of them that they want to do it again. The Kierkegaard got plenty of interest at the end, and we could go in that direction instead. We also
personally, I would be
sorry, go ahead.
Oops, sorry. I'd be interested in the Kierkegaard and or just, an existentialist of some kind. And on the other hand, and this doesn't maybe quite as directly relate, but I'm pretty interested in phenomenology, and I've been reading some Max Scheler recently. So if that was something that interested people.
There are other phenomenologists. phenomenologist, I'm more interested in Schiller. If I wanted to just start on phenomenology things, I might do something from Husserl. I could also see doing something on Levinas and phenomenologic tradition. Probably not Merleau-Ponty, but Kierkegaard is possible. In terms of the existentialists, just give me a second. So this is the other Heidegger I was possibly thinking of. I don't know if that's it's back to Greeks and back to Plato in a way, but it's the original Gigantomachia, the war of the giants over being, right? As originally discussed in Plato.
That appeals to me.
Being talked about by Heidegger. And this is relatively early Heidegger, if people care. Sorry, give me a second. Yeah. So this was at the University of Marburg in the winter semester of 24-25. So this is before being in time, while that was still being worked on. So what we're going to see here is a direct engagement with the, some of the core things in Plato. This is the Plato of the Sophist it's the, instead of being Socrates, it's the Parmenidean stranger, right? The Parmenidean stranger talking about what is the sophist, and tried to catch the sophist by the method of diaresis, or dividing things up. We get the story of the greatest kinds, how the ideas participate with one another, the debate between the believers in matter and the believers in mind over the nature of being. So a lot of meaty stuff in it, as a basic point, just from it being that dialogue. It does have the feature that there's lots of sections where he's giving a whole bunch of the words in Greek. If you have no Greek, including no Greek letters, it can be frustrating at times to that's like he's is someone going to translate this, or is it going to just be in Greek? But the more Greek you have, the easier some of that is what I'm trying to say. So I don't know if that's technically challenging to the point of being frustrating. It's not a short work, so I don't know if we want to sign up for it. It's 400 pages or so. Kierkegaard might be more accessible. But I don't know. I mean, I think Craig, Gabrielle have probably already read the Kierkegaard. Joe probably hasn't. Alex, I don't know. Have you? Have you already read Kierkegaard?
I've read quite a bit. Yeah. Kierkegaard.
So I mean, it might be that it's just not new enough or fresh enough. But you can tell me.
Personally, I wouldn't mind reading it again. I think there's always more to be got from it. But sorry, Craig.
No problem. I just had a quick question on how much Heidegger's Plato's Sophist relates to his Parmenides.
It's a little bit earlier. The Parmenides is in a way an easier book because it deals primarily with just the truth thing. It's not a crazy notion to do the Parmenides, actually, when I think about it. In a way, the Parmenides is an easier book. But part of the reason it's an easier book is he kind of doesn't get as far into into actual Parmenides. He talks about Parmenides. He talks about the start of his poem. He talks about a few of the myths in Plato, and it's mostly around this aletheia notion of truth in the Greeks. That's mostly what the Parmenides book is about, which, you know, not a bad thing. That's this one. Those who don't know.
Yep, that's the one.
Yeah, and this is much shorter, 160 pages, reasonably accessible.
It's less expensive on Amazon, like quite a bit. And if it's shorter,
it is shorter.
If it's short, yeah.
This one is contemporary with the Nietzsche work we were reading the other time. It's during the war. There are some weird things in it, no question. It's Heidegger. It's going to be weirdness. It's not a crazy idea. If we were going to do a Kierkegaard, do people have a particular work in mind? I mean, I would think The Sickness Unto Death, but someone can tell me otherwise. Just assuming philosophical enough.
Yeah, I like that idea, Sickness Unto Death. It's been a while since I read Kierkegaard. The one that I physically own is Works of Love, which is maybe less philosophical, but
yes.
But I think I've read Sickness Unto Death maybe once, so it would definitely be rewarding to revisit it. And then I also have just a completely different philosopher, just to throw more ideas out there, which I've been intending to read for a while, which is Bergson.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't know if that would be something interesting. I have on my book list, I think it's Matter and Memory to read. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, Bergson's challenging in his own way, very 19th century problematic, and especially around time and freedom, really. So I would put the main problematics, and that does lead into some of the later sort of life role existentialism, if I can put it that way. The thing that I find in Bergson is that you get some thoughts which are there in people like Husserl and Heidegger, in a sense, more fully formed. So you have to get groping versions of them, right? Because he's still trying to find his way towards the clear thought on it, and that can be challenging in its own way. It's like you've got a guide trying to take you on a journey, and he's a third of the way there, maybe half. But Bergson is definitely worth reading, but it's challenging for those reasons. And I think easier if you've already got all the stuff that came later, in some ways. Of these, I'm inclined to go in the direction of the Kierkegaard. I think it might, spark some external interest too. That is other people coming in. I think that if we manage to get Jim back, he would be happy to read it. But let's think about possible Parmenides as a down the road. But let's I'll think about it. But I'm inclined to say that the next thing we're going to read is going to be the Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard. For those who don't know, the sickness unto death is despair. That's what we're going to be reading about. In a way, it's a founding text of existentialism, both in the method and in the subject matter, and in the angstiness of it, if I can put it that way. but it's one of his more philosophical works.
How does it compare with concept of anxiety?
Yeah, very close. But I think that philosophically, it's the more interesting book. It's the one that's going to give us. We're going to be able to relate it to things that are there in Hegel. We're going to be able to relate it to things that are there in the concerns that we just saw in the little section about him in this piece. But it's also a good concentrated philosophical blast of Kierkegaard, if I can put it that way. Yeah. So, all right. I'm selling myself the more I think about actually teaching it. That would be, we'd be looking at that for something like the 14th to 21st of February, if people want to get a copy of it before then.
Which one is this? Say, this is the sickness unto death?
The sickness unto death. That's right.
Yep.
It's
under $20 new.
Yeah, you can find old copies of it, for 10 cents everywhere. It just might not be in the greatest shape. Yeah, it was an immensely popular in the sense of, I don't know, as philosophy works go, it's a well-read one. Let's put it that way. Okay, that's the thought. All right, so I'm now 31st for the rest of Gilson, and then we'll try to do a little Kierkegaard, a little bit of the Dane. We'll decide next time if it's the 14th or 21st, and I'll also, give a specific reading next time. It won't be the whole thing, but we'll probably do that in just a couple of sessions, like 2 to 3. I guess it's not that long work. All right, sounds good. Any other last minute remarks, questions, thoughts before we go?
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Thanks,
Yep.
Chase.
All right, so I'll put the recording up later tonight if people want to review things, and see you guys next time.